Perfect. We are online. Good morning or hello to anyone who is watching this from the recording. Good. That's it for the introductory things. Let's get to the presentation. So before I get to any introductions of who I am or what Finax is as a company, let me share a little story with you. When people ask me what personal finance management is about, I like to compare it to taking care of your physical health, right? So I believe that taking care of your physical health, so getting in shape, going to the gym, eating healthy, in the past couple of years became a pretty normal part of our culture, right? There's a lot of information about it, and a lot of people are trying to do it. You see people going to the gym around you. You see people trying to eat meals that contain enough protein per day. You see people counting calories and doing similar things. We also know that unhealthy habits such as smoking can lead to long-term risks. This is information that is well known, and we also see many people trying to take care of their physical health. We see many people trying to go to the gym, being supported by their friends. It's just something normal. And I believe that over the course of this presentation, I will convince you that taking care of your financial health is pretty similar. It's also about these little habits that can create risks or help you in the long run. It's also about being able to maintain some sort of discipline over very long periods if you want to be in good financial shape, right? It's also something that you can actively take care of, right? For example, when you spend more than you earn over the long run, you will probably accumulate debt, which is similar to when you consume more calories than you can burn throughout the day, you will accumulate some fat on your body. So really, this analogy works pretty well. Sadly, one very big difference between financial and physical health is that financial health, especially in Slovakia or Central Europe, is not that deeply engraved in the culture yet, right? We don't talk about it. We don't ask for help within it because we consider it something still pretty private. It's sort of a taboo. We don't really want our friends, family, or colleagues to know how much we earn or that we live paycheck to paycheck or ask them for help because we are really broke and need some tips to save money. This is usually considered embarrassing, and therefore people don't talk about it, don't share, don't ask for tips, don't ask for help. And that is really a pity because then it's much harder to get support in building your habits. Then it's much harder to get good advice on what to do or inspiration on how you can improve your financial situation. And this webinar and this series of topics that we will be presenting, and actually a lot of the activities that we as a company do in the market, is trying to break this taboo, trying to make finance something which is normal to talk about, which is normal to seek help within, and which could potentially be something equally ingrained in culture as taking care of your physical health, so that we are not embarrassed and scared to talk about it. And we will try to go over it and build this analogy so that it's pretty understandable. So that's it for the introduction. But before I get to anything more specific, I would first like to introduce myself so that you understand where I take the audacity to teach you or educate you about anything related to finance, right? So, as I said in the beginning, my name is Shimon. I work in Finax as an analyst. I've worked in Finax for the last almost 4 years now. And the areas that I usually cover are, I would say, fourfold. I do a lot of communication and content. So that is anything that is related to presenting our products and philosophy to outside actors. So you can imagine our podcasts, our webinars, our articles, blogs, media contributions, any other sort of presentations or video materials, that email communication that we put outside. I am also involved a lot in product. I'm also a member of the investment committee of Finax. So whenever we are creating products that have some investment strategies, that have some portfolios, I'm usually involved in the process. I usually also, for a couple of times, I was the the project lead of when we had a project of either changing a product or launching a new product. So I really have a lot of insight into investment products, and I will try to share those insights and the stories that I learned along the way with you today within the webinar. And lately, I've also been involved in corporate finance, so that's budgeting and tracking expenses, not on the personal level, which I also do, but on the level of the entire company. So I believe that I've accumulated some insights that could be useful to you. Before that, I worked in the media for a short period. I studied abroad. I studied in Amsterdam, and I also spent a semester at the University of Hong Kong, majoring in economics and finance over my studies. So it's been a long-term hobby of mine. I also have formal education behind me. That's about me. You might also be interested in what my company is. Finax is, I believe, now a relatively well-known brand in Slovakia, but we are also active across several Central European countries. What we are is essentially a securities broker dealer. We offer managed portfolios, usually based on ETFs. So it is passive investing where you don't do some active decisions, analyzing stocks and so on. You usually just hold the entire market and try to minimize the cost and tax burden of the investment. That is what we do. We offer a range of portfolios now. The baseline, most famous product is called Intelligent Investing, which is sort of 11 portfolios with different risk levels and a questionnaire, so-called robo-advisor, into which you enter your intended investment horizon and preferences and risk tolerance, helps you select the most suitable portfolio in terms of risk. So a portfolio that is the most suitable for your goal, whether it's saving up for a down payment on purchasing your own housing or saving up for retirement. It helps you sort of select. We also have some conservative products for very short-term savings. So that can be from a couple of months to 3 years. There are 2 portfolios built on sort of more safe investment instruments, safer ETFs. We also have a solution called the Intelligent Annuity, which is we will also talk about it during the webinars. It's a payout portfolio. So that's for people who already have accumulated a lot of wealth and are looking for an investment solution that will help them draw passive income. So it's a portfolio from which we will automatically sell off investments, send you some monthly income, and set up the investment in a way so that you are either likely to leave some inheritance for your kids or just draw down the entire savings over the period over which you would like to draw that passive income. And lately, this is also the reason why these webinars were created. We became a pension provider via the so-called pan-European personal pension product. We will talk about it a lot towards the end of today's webinar. You can imagine it as a third pillar that is transferable and applicable with equal rules across the entire European Union. So it's a third pillar, but not created by states, but created by the European Union. Finax, as a Slovak company, became the first official provider of this product in the entire European Union. And it involves some advantages and some sort of effort to reform the way third pillar currently functions across Europe. We will talk about all the problems the third pillar has and all the advantages that the pan-European pensions have later on in this presentation. But these are essentially the products we offer. And I think the most important piece of information for you from this presentation is that, or from this introduction of the company, is that we also connected this, providing of portfolios with a lot of financial education. That's partially because we believe that people deserve free and quality information on finance. It's our hobby, and we simply like to educate people and help people with it. There's a lot of good feelings involved. Many people are really grateful for it. So we usually offer a lot of educational content for free. But it also makes sense from the business perspective when you think about it, because you can't just throw a portfolio at people. You need to teach them how to use it wisely and how to connect it with the general way they manage their money. Because unless you teach a client how to handle a portfolio wisely, then it can turn really dangerous. And you have probably heard about disclaimers such as investing can be risky, you can get at a loss, you can panic and make emotional mistakes. With our educational content, we are trying to prevent that, educate people on what the emotional mistakes are, how to handle the portfolios wisely. So we produce a lot of free content. It's in the form of articles, podcasts, webinars. You can find all of that on our YouTube channels or on our website. And a part of it is the program that you are currently watching. So we have created a series of webinars, a series of lectures that we usually offer to companies so that they can offer it, as a benefit to their employees, which we call Finax Financial Wellness. It's sort of a summary of all the educational content that we have created over the years, and it's centered around 3 topics. You will see all of these topics at once in today's presentation. So we have 4 hours reserved. It will be a lot of content. I will try to make it, simple. We will have breaks in between. We will have Q&A sessions in between so that you get to wake up in the middle. But this is sort of an agenda of what you can expect today. We will start by the topic I will start with in one slide, essentially, and that is personal finance basics and emergency fund. So we will talk about questions such as why even care about personal finance? Why is that something you should be interested in and you should handle wisely in your life? Then we will talk about emergency fund, which is sort of a reserve of money, a financial cushion that you have saved for unexpected expenses, for accidents that need to be paid for right away, and that you might not have money for, only from your salary. So you have some fund reserved for those dangerous expenses that can occur unexpectedly, right? So we will talk about that. We will talk about how to create it, how large it should be, where to keep it, and similar questions. Afterwards, we'll have a short break and a Q&A session, and then we'll jump to the topic of investing. We will talk about what you can invest in, what are the asset classes, if you want the professional word for it, into which you can invest, how is the profit created, what are the risks of investing, and then we'll talk about how to construct an investment portfolio, what kind of portfolio is more suitable for short-term goals and what kind for more long-term goals, such as retirement, which might be decades away. And we'll also talk about differences between the so-called active and passive investing. I already suggested that we as a company do the passive investing. We will discuss both their advantages, disadvantages, and our preferred approach of passive investing, sort of some arguments why we think it's the most suitable approach for normal people. And then after investing, we will talk about the most important financial goal, or the most major one in the lives of most people, and that is securing a pension. It's saving for retirement. I'm saying this is one of the major goals because it's the most expensive, right? If you really want to secure extra income over a long period of time, which will be retirement, in which many of us will live 15, 20, even 25 years, according to the life expectancies as of now, you need a lot of money, right? It's an expensive goal, and therefore it requires really long-term preparation. So it's an important expense, and we will talk about, how the pension systems work, how you can use the second and third pillar to help yourself secure a better pension. We will talk about how to prepare for retirement yourself on your own, so using your own savings, your own investments. And we will also introduce the concept of the European pension that I talked about and compare it to the third pillar. And I will try to convince you that in most European countries, third pillar is currently not functioning very well, and that this is a good, fresh competition that has the potential to improve the way we save for pensions significantly. So that is for today's agenda. As I said, it will be a long session, so I understand that it might be a lot of information to swallow. So please don't be afraid to ask questions. Post them through Slido. You have the code in the chat. Feel free to interrupt me and ask for a better illustration, a better story, a better explanation of anything that is on the slides. I expect that this first topic will take roughly 30 to 40 minutes of content. Then we can have a Q&A session and a break so that you know what to anticipate. Okay, let's get to it. I will start. It's usually good to start with the why question, right? So before telling you anything specific about how to save money or whatever, I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about why I think caring about personal finance is important in general. The first major reason that I want to cover is that for most people, income is temporary. What I mean by this is that none of us will probably have the energy, mental capacity, and even willingness to work forever, right? I don't think anyone joined at this call wants to be working when you are 70 or 75. And you're often not even able to due to declining energy levels due to declining cognitive capacity. You just want that decent period of taking a rest when you are older, right? That means that you probably won't be able to work as hard, as long hours, as much, or even work, period, as when you were younger, right? So you will lose the income from your salary. And it's important then to have something to take care of you. Many of you might be thinking that this is supposed to be the state, and that is partially true. However, and that is also connected to the second reason I have here, that state pension system is unreliable. I will be talking to you about why the state, although it was in the past and it still currently is capable of taking care of old people to some extent, their ability to do it, or the state's ability to take care of us and provide us with really decent retirements, will decline, and it will be very difficult for states in the future. So while they still will be able to provide us with some basic needs, such as maybe income for housing and food, it really won't be about traveling, spending time with your grandkids and similar things. So if you really want a decent pension without stress, it's good to have some extra income on top of state pension. It's good to have some wealth that will take care of you and that you can, draw support and a feeling of security from when you don't have income. And that is really what, healthy financial habits can help you with. So those are the first two reasons. Another one is a common one. I've experienced it many, many times in my life. And that is the stress of living paycheck to paycheck, right? That is the stress of just not having enough money when the last week before the next paycheck is happening and you don't know how to even cover basic needs. You can't really enjoy those days. You are really stressed. If you know this feeling, then I'm with you because I've experienced this feeling in the past. You might remember that I studied abroad. I studied in very expensive cities, actually. Like Amsterdam and Hong Kong are known for not being the cheapest options out there. I'm also not from a family that is particularly well off. So, I remember, and I already had to manage a lot of my money alone, right? So I remember the feelings of when I couldn't do what the wealthier kids were doing because I didn't have money for it, go out to more expensive clubs or anything. And I also remember just struggling to have enough money for food without going into minus or your bank account or something like that in the last week before my next paycheck or my next allowance arrived. So I know how stressful then indecent that can be. And I also know the feeling of getting out of it and, having some extra money even when your next paycheck arrives. Just the mental comfort that then brings you is amazing. And it's in itself, getting rid of the stress, getting rid of the humiliating feelings, right? The mental comfort that you can get is alone a reason why I care about personal finance. Just like not having your finance in order is extremely stressful. And that is the reason why getting them in order is an important goal to live your life in a happy way and comfortable way. And that is connected with this last reason, which is the feeling of security, right? That can be in many forms, right? So the first feeling of security that wealth brings you is that you have an emergency fund for unexpected situations, right? You're not afraid that when your washing machine breaks down or where there is a weird light in or weird control in your car lit up, that you won't have to take out a loan or secure some other way to pay for it, right? So you are prepared for unexpected situations. Wait, I didn't want to roll this out yet. So first of all, you are prepared for unexpected expenses. But the feeling of security also comes from having the freedom to do what you do, right? When you already have more wealth, more money, usually you are able to, say no more often or take care of opportunities or do something that you really like much more. Think about it. When you have enough money to live off it completely, for a couple of months, it's easier to say goodbye to a job that was stressful to you or a job where you weren't really feeling like you were accepted by the colleagues and look for a better one, right? Spend a couple of months searching around and trying to get a job that will really be good for you and where you will really feel good. It will be much easier to do that decision of changing careers or changing companies when you have some money. It will be much easier to start a business if you want to, if you have some money that can take care of your family for a couple of months or years, right? It will be much easier um, to perhaps later on, when you have really substantial retirement savings, it might be easier to stop doing a job that requires long working hours and that is stressful and switch it for a job with lower income, lower salary, but one that doesn't have such long working hours and isn't so stressful, so that you can focus more on your family and being with your kids. All these decisions, the feeling of freedom and the security connected with it, come with money, right? So it's good to have your financial cushion built up, right? So personal finance really is about questions such as, how to save for retirement, how large should my emergency fund be, how to protect money from inflation once you have some savings and want to work with them wisely, or whether investing even is safe, a very relevant question in Central Europe with all the scams that we've experienced. Let's look at these reasons a bit more, in detail. So I really like this graph because it sort of illustrates the entire philosophy that we are trying to teach people, right? Human capital is just our ability to generate income. So it's our ability to work, right? When we still have energy to do it. And as I said, it will be declining over life. And the purple line is your financial capital. So it's the wealth you have. It's the money that you have sitting somewhere in an investment account or somewhere where you can draw supportive income from it. And if you work wisely with it, so the entire goal is to save a portion of your income and build up some wealth from it. The more wealth you have, the more it can take care of you when you are old and unable to work, right? Because, wealth can pay for education of your kids. It can pay for your retirement. It can pay for unexpected expenses for which you don't have income because you don't work anymore. So that is the entire goal. The entire goal is to save a portion of your income when you can work and build up wealth that will take care of you once you cannot work anymore. This is a graph that illustrates the pension problem. So I will be talking about this in a bit more detail in the third topic, centered around pensions. But the problem is this. Most pension systems in Europe work like a pipeline, a pipe through which something flows from somewhere to somewhere. I like to use this analogy because that's essentially how it works. Most European pension systems, especially the state ones, the state pensions, work by taxing income of people who are currently working and immediately paying that out to current retirees, right? So you have a bunch of people working, you force them to pay social security contributions in January, and you use that money that you raised via that tax or contribution to pay out pensions right in February, right? This is good as long as you have enough working people and not many people who are retired, right? Because you raise a lot of money and you don't have that many people who you have to pay out pensions to. However, the problem is that Europe is aging. We will see a lot of numbers about it, but we are rapidly aging. Not many kids are being born right now due to preferences, due to options, due to the fact that having kids is more expensive than in the past, right? So fewer people are being born. And on the other hand, strong generations from generations where a lot of kids were born, such as the post-war generations, or in Slovakia, we have this generation called Husakové děti, which was born in the 70s during the socialist era. So you have those slowly retiring. So in the future, you will have much more old people to take care of and much fewer people who are working. So you will have a lower income into the state budget, and you will have much larger expenses to pay out. So it will be very difficult to raise enough money to pay out decent pensions. This means that most experts think that in the future, either pensions won't be rising enough to match inflation, so their real value will be declining, or they might even be forced to decrease them, for example, by canceling some 13th pensions in some countries or something like that, your Christmas bonuses. That is why most experts, and you can see that in this chart, anticipate that in the future, that is the blue squares, that's anticipated pensions in 2070. The pensions are quantified by the so-called replacement rate. That sounds very technical, but it really isn't. So what the replacement rate is or means is what portion of your previous income so of the income you were used to when you were working, you can expect to get on your pension. So, and it's expressed as a percentage. So, for example, if the replacement rate is 50% and you used to be earning, I don't know, 1,000 euros after taxes when you were working, you can expect 500 euros on pension because it's 50% of your previous salary. And most experts think that in European countries, this will be between 20 to 50% in 2070. So in a couple of decades. That means that from state pension, you can expect only 20 to 50% of the income you were used to when you were still working. That means that from month to month, essentially, you will have to cut down your expenses pretty rapidly, in some instances by 3/4, which is a lot. It's probably not very imaginable for most people. And that is the idea that I wanted to illustrate, that state pensions will be enough to maybe cover a portion of basic needs, but it definitely won't be enough for that comfortable and stress-free retirement all of us imagine as decent, right? And therefore, it's good to, care about personal finance so that you can build up some wealth that will provide you with some extra income. And then this last chart that I wanted to show you in my introduction is another very important fact. Taking care of your wealth is often neglected in Europe, and especially in Central and Eastern European countries. I circled some of them for you here. The reason I think that it is apparent from this chart is by looking at how much of savings or of wealth that households have is just held in cash. And you might have heard about it in the media. Cash doesn't appreciate in value usually. You can just think about how much you get on your savings account. In most major banks, it's still not above inflation or not above zero even in many big banks. So cash is often just eroded by inflation, right? The things that usually multiply your wealth are investments in financial assets, so in stock markets or in real estate and stuff like that. And you can see that mostly in our countries, we either hold cash or we hold some investments or insurance policies, which usually just invest in very cautious investments similar to cash, so ones that aren't very risky but yield returns just close to inflation, right? So we don't have, and it makes sense when you think about it, we have our socialist past. So back then it was impossible to invest in financial markets. So no one did, and no one was taught to take care of their wealth. So we didn't really have anyone to teach us how to do it compared to maybe some countries which have a longer habit or tradition of investing. So we usually don't invest, and that's a pity because then we lose out to inflation and we don't multiply our wealth. We don't extract as much, wealth and income as we could over our lives from every euro that we earn. We usually spend 40, even more hours trying to earn money, but we spend very little time taking care of that money, distributing it among reasonable investments so that we would be expected to appreciate this wealth over time, right? And that is a pity because we lose out on money, and that is another reason why we are trying to teach people to take better care of their personal finance, right? Okay, enough for the depressive statistics on how everything is bad. That's really not the goal of this presentation. I just wanted to, give you motivation for why we think this is really an important topic to think about. Let's move on to the second part of this first topic, and that is, what are the steps that you can take if you want to get your, put your finance in order? So what are the very first steps that you can take right this evening or right this weekend? The first step is so-called financial analysis. I like to compare it to stepping on the scale or looking in the mirror when, we compare it to taking care of your physical health. So the first thing you need to know is what your situation even is. Are you overweight or are you in good shape? Are you healthy or not? So that can only be done if you look into the mirror or if you visit a doctor to do your regular checkup or something like that. So you can do that doctor's checkup yourself. You can check the indicators of your financial health. So the first thing you should know about your situation is how much you earn. This isn't very difficult for most people. We know what paycheck arrives in our account each month, but we should also sum up, some one-off income. So for example, year-end bonuses or some other income. When I was at the university, I included allowance from my parents on top of my salary because that is essentially another sort of income. If you have an investment property, then you can include the rental income. Any tax bonuses, for example, if you have kids, can count. Anything that you can, that you have to save and spend essentially. Then once you know that, you can check what wealth you have built from your income. That is already a bit harder because some people are embarrassed for not having saved much over their life, so they prefer not to even, check that. But it's really important if you want to know whether your habits have been healthy or not in the past. So just check what wealth you managed to build from your income over your working life. So that is any bank savings, investment accounts. It can be the approximate value of your house, or furnishings, any savings in the second pillar, third pillar schemes, if you have some, even if your employer, for example, contributes on your behalf. All these things you can sum up and come up with an approximate value of what you own. Do not spend much time on this. This can, you don't have to have an expert estimate the value of your house. Just, maybe check similar offerings in your surroundings or something like that. Come up with a rough estimate. It's not the goal to have the exact value for cents, but to have a rough idea of what your situation is. Then, and I believe now the most important part, is expenses. So this is where usually people usually know how much they earn and what wealth they have, what they own. But expenses, that's a different category because we are often embarrassed for our expenses. So we prefer not to even check what we spent on, especially if it was some silly spending that we might then be embarrassed of. We prefer not to look. But that's the worst thing you can do. That's just denying any problem. And as I'll say later, it's not embarrassing to spend money. You spend to live happily, and that's good. But you need to be aware of what you spend on, because if you're not aware, then you might be spending on things that don't make you happy. And that is a problem, because then you'll gamble away, your life and freedom for things that you don't even want, right? So open your bank account or bank app and check transactions for the past, let's say, 3 or 4 months, and try to categorize them somehow, right? So try to sum up the amounts that you spent on transport, on housing, on family, on health, on fun and going out, or on vacations and stuff like that. Try to put boxes to the categories of spending and try to come up with an average number that you spend per category for the past couple of months, right? So you can, for example, learn that on groceries and restaurants, so for eating, you've spent on average 300 euros in each of the past 3 or 4 months, right? That is essentially the result that you want to get. You can either do this manually, or you can use personal finance management apps, little tools that we can use. I will cover them later on in this presentation and give you some tips on what you can just, link to your bank accounts and it will do this automatically, or you can do it in an Excel. Back in my days when I was doing it for the first time, I just did it in an Excel, like the control. Okay, so that's expenses. And then the least liked debt. Sum up the total outstanding principals of any debt that you haven't paid off yet, right? So that's mortgage, any consumer loans, any leasings, any credit cards, or sort of negative debits, we can call that in your bank account when you went into a minus. So anything like that. And the reason we are trying to be aware of our debt is that we can subtract it from our wealth to get this metric that is called the net worth. It's what you own minus what you owe to other people. And the goal of everything we will talk about today is to have your net worth increasing. So to increase the amount you own and to decrease the amount you owe to other people. The reason is that your net worth represents everything that we talked about, all the freedom, or all the feeling of comfort, all the feeling of security, right? If you don't own anything and you just have debts to pay off, that is when you start feeling stressful. That is where you can't save up for anything because all your savings get eaten up by repayments to the bank. Whereas if you own a lot of things, if you have a lot of money in your investment account, if you have a house that is paid off, that is the money, the wealth that takes care of you, right? So once we perform this financial analysis, we can start with setting a budget for the future. The reason we have budgets, or What even is a budget? Budget is a plan of spending. It's a specific target amount or maximum amount that we want to spend per category in the future, right? So it can be assigning a target amount on how much we want to spend on food, on restaurants, on fun, on transport, on family, on random expenses, on anything you can think of, right? So assigning a plan. Some of those you can control, some of those, not much, such as some fixed expenses that need to be paid, but you sort of have to set up a plan for yourself. So I will now tell you some ideal proportions of what a budget could look like. And I understand that at first this will seem unrealistic. Most of you probably won't be able to save or set aside as much. Bear with me. We will then discuss what to do if your spending seems to be higher than suggested by this. So an intuitive rule for what a good budget could look like is to spend roughly 50 to 60% on necessities. So that is any housing, any loan repayments, phone bills, basic groceries, basic clothing, just anything that you need to pay for if you want to survive until the next month, right? Something that categories that we can't just not spend on because we would die. Then we have some nice to have expenses. These are expenses that, you don't have to spend on because you would survive without them, but that make our life good and enjoyable. Those are the expenses we are living for. So that is traveling, holidays, nice restaurants, better fashion, hobbies, going out with your friends, sitting on your, coffee dates or grabbing a beer with the boys, anything you can imagine like that, cinemas, right? It's good to have roughly 30% reserved for these nice to have expenses. And then at the beginning, it's good to reserve roughly 10 to 20% for savings and investment. That is just an amount that you set aside and that you use to fulfill your financial goals. So financial goals can be anything from saving up money to have an emergency fund for unexpected accidents and unexpected expenses, all the way to saving up for retirement. So sending money to some investment account where you have your savings ready for retirement, right? It's good to have 10 to 20%. So when you are trying to put your finances in order, it's good to sort of try at first to push your budget into roughly these proportions. It's an intuitive rule, but it's good to save at least 10 to 20. That is what experts have calculated as a good amount to set aside if you want to retire comfortably and without any stress and not really being reliant on other people and politicians and their wills to take care of you, right? Now, let's talk about two important questions, right? The first might be, how does this develop over time? So if you manage to do this, then, or even if, at first it's sort of because you have lower income, it's sort of difficult to spend only 50 to 60% on necessities. I get you. The best way to boost your savings rate over the long run is growth of income, right? So your essentially goal throughout your career should be to progress to more senior positions that bear higher pay, right? And you should take active steps to do that, such as getting more education, getting certificates, negotiating about your wage. We will talk about that a bit later. But if your income grows as you progress to more senior positions, as you get extra certifications, as you get extra references, and get positions that are paid more, then you can boost your savings rate, right? So a good rule is that usually whenever you get a salary hike, then you can allocate 50% of that to spending and 50% of that to extra savings. That's, again, an intuitive rule that you can do. And what that does is that whenever your income increases, you will be spending a bit less on necessities, and you can allocate the increases into nice to have expenses that make your life better and into savings, right? So when you are at the beginning of your career, you might be spending most of your income on necessities, but you should be striving that towards the end of your career, when you are in your late 40s, in your 50s, you should be spending much less on necessities and boost your savings rate and boost, the portion you spend on things that are nice in life, that are, that make our lives in general nicer and more enjoyable. This will be much easier if you are aware of it, right? So that's actually one of the best advices I've probably heard. It was I read it in this book called The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel, one of the most well-known financial authors ever. You can read that book if you want. And he essentially said that he thinks something that is worth or something that will make you rich much more than trying to, squeeze out and limit every coffee purchase that you can do when you are young is sort of setting some relatively modest lifestyle when you are young. So when you are in your 20s or early 30s, setting some lifestyle you are comfortable with, where you sort of have your needs and wants covered, but also and are happy, but also are saving a portion, right? And then just try to keep that lifestyle over your life because you've set it up in a way where you are happy. The problem is that oftentimes as our income grows, we just spend away all that money and get used to more expensive lifestyle that we would be, unimaginable for us when we were 25 or 30. But now we have a larger car. Now we want to have a pool in our garden. Now we want to be eating out in restaurants much more often than we were when we were young. And I understand that makes life a bit more fun. But you also have to realize that oftentimes people who do this fall into debt. They are still living paycheck to paycheck despite having much higher incomes. And they are reporting feeling much less happy than when we were younger. When you ask, I don't know, even when I asked my parents what the best period of their life was, they often remember, the time when they were young, when they were just starting a family, when they were starting their careers. And, the um, the fun thing is that um, that oftentimes they didn't have much money back then, but reported being the happiest, and that is probably because they, um, that is probably because they were much more free back then, and freedom can be secured by having a lot of savings. So it's good to think about these little trade-offs. We have a remark in Slido that if you have school-age children in your 40s, those necessities increase rather than decrease. That is true. Then you can keep nice to have expenses in the same proportion and divert your increases in paycheck into taking care of your family. But the good thing about this remark is that it also means that you won't need as much money as you had in your working age in your retirement, right? So many people who have kids, once kids move out and finish their education, then they, their expenses sort of decrease because they don't have to take care of their kids anymore. So they can live off lower amounts than in their working age. So they don't need, to save as rapidly for retirement. So that can also turn into an advantage once you are old. But yeah, I agree that the necessities can increase. You can, divert. I'm counting on the fact that you will be diverting some of your income increases into the necessities or into the expenses. But it also illustrates why it's good to start saving for having a family early on, right? So if you have a 10% savings rate also before you start a family, before you have to take care of your kids, then you might have some savings for the time when they need to go to high school or by the time they need to go to the university, and that money can help you, alleviate that pressure from your uh, the question is that is the most pressing, and that is what to do when your expenses are just too high to save any money. This is what many people struggle with at the beginning. Um, the first thing I would like to change about your perspective is that oftentimes people demonize these sort of financial advice or something like that because they think that in order to save you have to stop enjoying life altogether because people will be telling you that, oh, you shouldn't get beers or go on coffee dates if you want to save money because how could you do something that irresponsible, right? It's just gambling money away from your future. And I in general think while it's good to be able to control yourself and not spend all the money you have on clubs or beers, it's sometimes better to start from the necessities or from the fixed expenses, right? From the expenses where we spend most of our money on, right? Rather than trying to squeeze out all the pleasure from our life. The reason is that if you start by trying to save on things that make your life, enjoyable, then you are more likely to give up, especially as when you have a lot of motivation at the beginning, you might be able to save a lot of money and just not spend on nice to have expenses for a couple of months. But if that really makes you miserable, then you might give it up kind of early on. And the whole goal of investing and of saving is to do it over very, very long periods of time so that you can accumulate a lot of money over your life. So it's usually the best to start trying to save from actually fixed expenses. So from expenses or from necessary expenses, from necessities. So from things that we need to spend on. The reason is that usually we spend the most money on these things. So if we manage to save even a relatively modest percentage on these, that can save us or suddenly free up 100 or 200 euros in our budget. Even just one adjustment in our life, one major change that we agree on with a partner, meaning that we might not even need to adjust any other habits because we suddenly freed up enough for investing and saving of 10 to 20%, right? So you can start from the big three. The big three is housing, food, and transport, right? That is usually what we spend most of our money on. So when it comes to the housing, it depends on where you are in your life, right? When you are without a family yet, and when you are starting your career just like me, you can choose to live in a smaller flat or share your flat with a roommate, with roommates rather than living alone. That can cut your housing expenses by a third or by a half, just like that, right? Later on, when you already can't live with your roommates because you are thinking about starting a family or so, you can think about living in a smaller flat or house when you are faced with the choice of what kind of housing to buy. Or you can live away further from the city center, especially if you have a job that allows you to work online, right? To work from home office. The pandemic did one good thing in normalizing the fact that we often don't come into the office. So if you can live further away from the city center and just have home office during most of the week, then that might allow you to save a lot, because we know that houses or flats closer to the city centers are usually more expensive. So you can think about those things. There are many other tips, good tips. I can't think of all of them off the top of my head. You can find a lot of tips online, right? When it comes to food, this was game changer for me. I used to eat out a lot, but you can first of all lower your spending on restaurants. So cook your lunches at home, just do your meal prepping, right? Cook a bunch of food that oftentimes from one cooking can last for 3 or 4 lunches, and you can just take it to your job rather than eating in the canteen or getting a delivery from a restaurant. That can cut your spending on food by again a third or so, right? Or you can choose not to buy expensive grocery items, maybe look for discounts a bit more. Again, there are a lot of tips, good tips online by people who managed to do this successfully. If you are interested in that, I suggest Googling or asking your friends maybe. Maybe they will have a good tip that will really be a game changer for you. When it comes to transport, we often recommend that people buy used cars. This is because if you buy a new car, then you will be required to pay much more for it, right? Some of you maybe know that when you buy or when there is a car, its price tends to decline rapidly in the first couple of years of usage. Oftentimes it's by a third or even more, right? Over just the first 2 or 3 years. So sometimes buying a car that is 3 years old and already has some kilometers on it can reduce the price significantly while not reducing the reliability of car too much, right? If you have a car that is 3 or 4 years old, that doesn't mean that you will need to pay for servicing it every month or every year, right? It will probably still be a very reliable car that doesn't break down all the time, but will be much cheaper compared to buying a new car where you would have to pay by several tens of percent more for that car, right? And then also you can try to minimize individual transport, right? So there are many tips. For example, if you can work on home office, you can agree with your boss that you won't be commuting, but you will, for example, work 3 out of 5 days from home, and then maybe 2 days, which are the most critical when you need to have more in-person meetings with your colleagues, you can come to the office. Or what my parents did when we were talking about it, they started commuting with their colleagues, right? So they just took one car. It fits 4 people who need to go to work in the same city, and they are just splitting the gas bills every month. This can probably also be something that reduces your bill that you pay for transport. So I recommend starting with these and maybe Googling some other advice. Then Before I move on to the next slide, let me answer the question that is in a Slido. Is a house a valuable asset to include in net worth? Even if it's fully paid and owned, it's not liquid. You can't use the money. You have to live somewhere. It's definitely an asset to include in the net worth. I do agree that it's not liquid. So it's usually, and that is why I also prefer to have financial wealth, because you can live of it. But there are still ways to work with it. So, for example, an idea we were thinking of is that when you are getting close to retirement, and especially as the kids move out and go either to a university or go to work and live on their own, you often don't need that big of a place, right? Many people have, are retired. Oftentimes, even their partner is deceased, and they are sitting on a 4-bedroom flat somewhere in Bratislava, which is worth hundreds of thousands of euros, and they just won't sell it. We think it's reasonable in these instances to just sell the house and move to a smaller place, and that from that sale alone, you can generate so much money that you will have a lot of supportive income in pension on your own. But also, I think the most important reason this is an asset that you should include in your net worth is that it helps you save, right? Once you pay off your house, you don't have to, you don't have to pay for housing, right? Especially when you are retired. So if you have current average pensions which is around 500, 600 euros, I believe, less than 600, I think, or something like that, having to pay for rent and utilities, that would kill you, right? Having that asset of a paid off house enables you to just pay for utilities, to just pay for energies. So, you can. It's a thing that allows you to save. It's a thing that, to an extent, takes care of you in a similar fashion as an emergency fund or retirement savings take care of you. They just help you, finance your life, and that is what we are striving for. So, although it might not be the most liquid asset, and I do agree that you should have other sorts of asset, not just like hold all your money in real estate, you should, it's still a useful asset. It's still an asset that will help you cover your expenses, reduce your expenses. It's still an asset that you can work with, for example, by selling it and moving into a smaller house when you are older. So it's in general. I see another remark. I find this advice good for students coming out of school, but for people who already have some life behind them, it seems far-fetched. I don't know. As a student, I don't buy a car or, deal with where I will live in general, right? So I believe that even older people can lower their spending on restaurants. Maybe it's more difficult because you already developed some habits, but like my parents applied a lot of these advice. So, and maybe I'm a little bit biased towards my young age, but as I said, online you will find a lot of good advice on what you can do. And even if you already have some life behind you and are used to some spending, that can still be reversed. If you already bought a large car and you could do with a smaller one that has that is a bit older, you can still sell the old car and buy a smaller one. Like, no one is prohibiting you from doing that. You just have to get creative, right? And then, once you look at the big three, so the fixed necessities, you should search for reserves in excess consumption, right? So that is just what you're spending regularly, and you might be shocked what you spend on. So where we are going with this is that when you start watching your expenses, you might learn that for some categories, you are spending much more than you wanted originally, right? So, for example, when I remember that for me, it was actually one of the big three expenses when, or not even big three, when I lived in my student times and I started checking my expenses, I learned that I'm spending much more on going out than I originally thought, and it's not that I didn't want to spend this, but it was just, over the month, these small amounts of, going out, even, for a shorter period of time from time to time during a month, accumulated to such a large amount that I was just like, no, I just can't spend that much. It's, not worth it to do it that often. So I started controlling myself a bit more. I started, for example, saying no a bit more and sometimes just stayed in and watched a movie on a Friday night rather than going out and spend money, right? And that doesn't mean that I lost all my friends and stopped talking to people. That's not the case. I just limited my spending a bit more because I realized that I was spending more than I was realizing. So once you start watching your expenses, you might learn that for some categories, although you want to have them in your life, you are just spending too much, and you might want to, say no a couple of times, maybe towards the end of the month. So then that's for all the small regular expenses, such as having fun going out or doing some hobbies, where just starting to watch your expenses might allow you to say no a couple of times and save some some extra 50 or 100 euros a month on that. And that again can be a significant contributor to starting to save at least 10% of your income, right? So yeah, always ask yourself the question of whether you spend your income on things that really make you happy or whether it's just some spending that is expected in the culture that you're doing to impress other people but isn't really worth sacrificing your freedom or not having an emergency fund for. All of this can be helped with using budget tracking tools, right? So as I said, you can track your budget or write down your expenses in an Excel, but that can be a lot of manual work that isn't really fun, right? As I said in the past, as I said a couple of minutes ago, no one probably likes to look at numbers too much, and we can probably imagine a lot of better ways to spend your weekend than sitting over an Excel sheet for an hour. So that's why so-called personal finance management apps were developed. These are just apps that you can link with all your bank accounts. So even if you have more of them in your household, or even if you have more personal accounts, such as maybe a Slovak bank, maybe a Revolut as well, and you use both of them during the month. So then you can link all your bank accounts with this, and they will automatically collect and categorize your expenses, right? So if you I don't know, just randomly spend over the month, it will tell you how much you have spent on housing or family, on food, on restaurants, and similar things. So that is what they do. And another great tool that is contained within them is that they also allow you to create budgets and they check your progress within those budgets. So they allow you to set a specific target amount for restaurants or for transport over the month, and they will, whenever you open them, they will tell you what percentage of the budget you have already spent. So whether you have 65% or 15% of the budget left until the end of the month. And then you can usually just compare that to the time of the month where you are in, and you know whether you're good or whether you should try to spend less on that category, right, until the end of the month. So if it's the 15th day, so roughly the half of the month, and you've already spent 75% of your budget, you know that you should try to say no a couple of times to this expense. On the other hand, if you've just spent 25% and it's over the half of the month, then you know you can reward yourself because you didn't spend enough. This is a good thing about the budget. It's not just a prohibition on spending. It's not to tell you that you shouldn't spend at all. It's also, a permit to spend without regret, right? So that's usually what sort of discourages people from doing or caring about personal finance, is that they have a feeling that they will be forced to be embarrassed about any spending they have. But that's not the goal of personal finance. The goal is to save 10% or 20% and spend everything else without regret, because we also have to enjoy life. So a budget can also allow you to know how much you can spend without feeling guilty about it. And that sort of develops a healthier relationship to your money than being blind, not having a budget, and trying to save on anything you can and not spend any money. That will make you miserable and very likely to give up. So that's also a good positive way to view a budget, right? We also have one solution specific for the Slovak market. So for example, these are screenshots from an app called You Need a Budget. It's probably the most popular one in the United States, and one of the first ones that was developed. So that is sort of an international one, but those can often struggle with categorizing expenses that occur in Slovakia, right? But many Slovaks use it. It's good. There are also Revolut budget, for example. So if you have Revolut, you can set up budgets there as well. We as Finax also developed our own solution. It used to be called Finbot. Now it's called Coach. It's directly as a feature of our app, but you can use it without investing through Finax. You can just download Finax app and use only the Coach, and it comes free of charge. So there is nothing, no fee or no subscription that you would need to pay for it. It essentially allows you to do what I said. It allows you to pair it with bank accounts. I can see the question about a colleague in the lobby. I don't see anyone in the lobby. I'm trying to let people in all the time, but currently I don't see anyone in the lobby. So maybe could you please ensure if the colleague is in the right meeting? Maybe there's a different link or something. But I would see it on the right. I have the panel open all the time. So maybe bad meeting or let's try to reload the meeting or something like that. Maybe it's just not showing for me due to some reason. I'm sorry for that. Okay, so that is, so as I said, it automatically categorizes your expenses, and then it allows you to create and track budgets. One extra feature that you can do in this coach is to create an overview of what you own and what you owe. So again, you can type in the value of your assets, so investment accounts, savings accounts, time deposits, or the rough value of the house you live in, and also liabilities. So you can track how much you still owe on the debt that you haven't paid off. So mortgage, any consumer loans, leasings for a car, or anything like that, right? That is so, and the good thing about this is that you can then track whether your net worth, so wealth minus debt, whether it is growing over time. So you can refresh it, let's say once a year, and see whether you've pushed yourself closer towards financial freedom or just increased the amount you own after you subtract all the debt, right? So the goal was to provide some objective digital advisory. This is to say that oftentimes when you have financial advisory in Slovakia, such as financial advisors, or Slovakia or in Central Europe in general, they often live off selling products, right? They often intermediate insurance or sell you a loan, and they get a cut of it from banks. So while that can still be very valuable advice, the problem is that there might be a little conflict of interest. So they might be pushed to only promote the banks that have enough money to pay them, or the ones that pay the most, right? Since Finax lives off its other investments and Coach doesn't have any income, essentially, it's a free feature that also doesn't intermediate anything to other parties. It can help you sort of more objectively without pushing you towards or nudging you slightly towards the party that pays the most, right? So we wanted to create something where you can get this overview without, being pushed into purchasing something so that the financial advisor can survive. So that is essentially the goal. You can check it out if you want. One important thing, actually the last one in this or penultimate in this topic, is to sort of remind you that, as we said, and I know that you're also feeling it based on your questions, that there is a limit on cutting your expenses. So I see you. I still think you should give it a try, because many of the tips that you find online might work for you if you just, watch your expenses, and if you give it a try. You might find that your life won't be as miserable by saying goodbye to some major expenses as you think right now. But I do admit, or I do agree, that there is a limit on cutting expenses. You can't just cut it down to zero, or you can't just, eliminate all nice to have expenses because you wouldn't enjoy life afterwards. So the best way to start saving or to boost your savings in the long run is focusing on income growth, right? This is an idea that I already had, right? Or said in the past. So the best way is just to get a raise, right? Sometimes for many of us, 10 to 20% of our incomes might be, 150, 200 euros. If you manage to get a raise that sort of gives you this extra 100 euros of net income after taxes, you might just divert that to savings without cutting any expenses, right? It's the easiest way. You just have to force yourself not to spend everything of that race, right? But sometimes negotiating a good race can be more effective than cutting expenses because you don't have to change your habits, right? So what I would advise everyone to do is to work on increasing their income over the long run, right? So focus on income growth and not to be vague. I mean, this is usually the best achieved through education, right? So education shouldn't stop when you get out of the university and now you just do some job for decades, right? It's good to work a job that fulfills you. It's good to work in an area and sphere that you find interesting so that, it's also genuinely interesting. You're actually fulfilling your curiosity when you are trying to learn something new, and just get some new ways of education, right? So this can be, it probably depends on the specific field, but this can be anything from getting courses and extra certificates, right? If you are in IT, you can learn working with, I don't know, a lot of new softwares or something like that, and getting certificates for that. There are nowadays good websites that offer courses and get you, some formal certification after you finish them. So there are courses for any type of software or something like that. They are usually called, like, one of them is Coursera. We have SkillMe. We have websites like this. You can again find good tips after you Google them online, right? You can get a formal certification. So, for example, I am currently right now working on obtaining my CFA, which is a Chartered Financial Analyst, certification that is very recognized in the field where I work, right? But there are licenses and certifications for accountants. There are ones for people working manual jobs, right? Where you can get a formal certification to work with more advanced machinery, for example. So, and again, that's something that you have to invest money in, but it can help you negotiate for a much better position. And it's also about soft skills, right? So it's about not expecting that my boss will give me a raise just like that, but asking for it actively. Maybe trying to ask more senior colleagues what skills could be needed in order to successfully get to their more senior position. Maybe checking out on online advertisements whether a similar position like yours doesn't have a better salary offered somewhere else, trying a couple of interviews, or in general watching more offers of more senior positions and checking what the entry requirements are, right? What kind of skills are they looking at, and what kind of certifications or proofs you can get to prove that you have those sort of skills. So that will require an investment of time and an investment of some money, but it might be the most comfortable and realistic way for many people to start saving money and to get out of living paycheck to paycheck. Even for me, income growth was one of the main ways, because it's much easier not to, to keep your current habits and not spend extra money than the other way around, and have the same money but try to cut down expenses. So, while there is a floor for expenses, there is no ceiling for income. And as I said, if you don't buy an extra coffee over a month, you save €3, right? And you will have to do that a lot of times and give up on a lot of pleasure in order to save a lot of money this way. But if you get one very substantial raise and advance on the corporate ladder, then that can earn you 30 extra thousand per year, for example, especially if you manage to do that successfully over a couple of times in a row, right? So it's really about different amounts that have much larger effects, right? And you should be checking whether regularly you invest time and money in your most valuable assets, which is you. It's your knowledge. It's something that no one can take away from you once you have it, right? So that would be about the personal finance basics. Now I would like to talk a bit about emergency fund, right? It's usually the best first financial goal you have, right? So when you start saving money and you don't have any savings yet, it's good to start with an emergency fund. Why? Let's explain. So emergency fund is just an amount of money that you have set aside for unexpected situation. So if you get laid off because there's an economic crisis and it might be difficult to find a new job for a couple of months, then you can draw extra supportive income so that you just don't live off unemployment insurance, but so that you actually can keep, financing your kids and everything else that you need to fund, right? Or if you are sick and are unable to work for a couple of months, you can also use that to draw some extra income. It's also insurance against any misfortunes. So domestic appliance breaks down or a car needs to be serviced and it's a significant amount. It can be a couple of hundreds or even thousands at some points. So you can use your emergency fund to finance these things. But also, and this is the reason why this is the first financial goal, it protects your wealth, right? So when we will be talking about investing, we will be talking a lot about why it's important to to invest for the long term, right? So invest for oftentimes, especially for retirement, right? 10, 15, 20, 25 years, a very long period of time, and not to sell the investment in the meantime, especially if there are declines in the financial markets and you are in red numbers and you need to wait for the economy to recover. We will explain that in the investing topic, but it's important not to panic and sell, right? And if you don't have an emergency fund, then an emergency happens that needs to be paid for, you might be tempted or you might be forced to sell off your investments in order to cover the broken car or something like that, right? Or to get income because you lost your job and unemployment insurance is not enough. So that way, you can be forced to make investing mistakes and not stick to the long investment horizon that is required in order to make any investing successful, right? So having an emergency fund also protects your investments from being sold off, in a bad manner. And then also it can protect you from inflation if prices increase. It can protect you from higher loan payments. This was relevant recently because you probably, especially those of you who have mortgages and everything, have probably noticed that due to inflation, interest rates went up and mortgages got really, really much more expensive than in the past. And then once the fixation period was over, many people needed to find money for much more expensive loan repayments, right? And so while this is something that is more long-term and it would probably draw down your emergency fund and you will need to find a better long-term solution for it, your emergency fund can help you finance it until you find some more long-term solution. So can help you with the higher loan payments if, until you find some other way to deal with it. But it also can help you take care of or utilize opportunities, right? As I said, changing a job that drains you of energy is much easier when you have some extra money set aside. Maybe starting a business, it's much easier when you have some money that will help you if you fail. Any other opportunities, it's just in general easier to risk and maybe be without a job for a month or two if you have money that will take care of you and your close ones, right? So even taking risks and utilizing opportunities, it's easier with an emergency fund. When people ask about, so once people save up for an emergency fund, they have a lot of good questions, such as how much money should we set aside or where to keep it. Starting with size of the emergency fund, this is highly individual. It depends on many factors. So, for example, people who are younger, don't have kids and don't have any debt that would be, left for their family to pay off if they, for example, died or something. And or that would have to be paid off after they lost their job. They don't need as much insurance, right? So they can save a little less. People who have kids or people who live or work in sectors that are more threatened by layoffs. So, for example, in private sector as compared to public sector is less endangered by the company not having enough profit and just announcing that it needs to downsize its labor force and lay off a couple of people. Usually these layoffs don't happen as often in public sector as in private sector, where you are dependent on whether your company can make enough profit, and if it's at a loss, it will announce layoffs, right? So maybe people in private sector who have kids should be saving up a larger emergency fund than people who work in public sector and don't have any dependents or don't have debts that would be left if they lost their job, right? Usually the range that is recommended is 3 to 6 monthly expenses, right, to set in your emergency fund. Again, it's individual where on this range you locate yourself. So the people who don't have to be covered that much can be closer to the 3 months. The people who need more protection can be closer to the 6 months. But whenever in this range, you should be generally okay. The goal is to allow you to survive off of your emergency fund completely, so fund all your expenses for a couple of months if you get laid off, for example, and just don't have income, or if anything bad happens, right? So roughly 3 to 6 months of expenses. And then you need to think about some other questions. So the first important thing is that your emergency fund should be liquid. That is what we talked about when we discussed the real estate, the house, right? The fact that it's not liquid, so it's not easy to get that money. It's not that easy to sell it very quickly. This should be easy with your emergency fund. The money should be accessible. When an accident happens and you need money, you usually need it quickly. You can't search around for a couple of months to find someone who will buy your house, right? So it's good to keep it somewhere where you can get to the money either immediately or within a couple of days at least, or within a week. So that should be the first thing to think about. Then you should also not be taking too much risk on it. This is logical. If there is a lot of risk, then the value of the emergency fund can just decline if the economy struggles or something like that, right? If interest rates go up and if stocks decline or if cryptocurrencies tank, right? So this is suboptimal because you need the most money when economy struggles, right? If you had 4 monthly expenses before, but now you have just 2 because the value of your emergency fund declined, and this is exactly when you need the money, then it's not really good, right? So you need to have a reasonable risk. However, it's good to at least try to match inflation, right? The long-term inflation is usually 2 to 3% per year. This can be lower in some years, and as we experienced in the past couple of years, higher in many other years. But usually, if you earn roughly 2 to 3% return per year, then you are able to match inflation, right? And what we believe is that you can allow yourself to take some risk, so allow for a slight fluctuation in the value of your account to get, to match inflation in the long run, because inflation is also not very pleasant on your emergency fund. It means that in 10 years time, you might be protected much less with the same amount of money if you don't appreciate it, because all the emergencies are now much more expensive, and they will be much more expensive in 10 or 20 or 15 years, right? So it's good to try to earn at least some return. Usually this can be achieved via a range of products. Currently, since interest rates are relatively high, the European Central Bank still has an interest rate of 3.5% on the deposit that it charges to commercial banks. That is why money market portfolios, you can note this down. Money market portfolios is a name for very safe, very short-term portfolios that usually just replicate the interest rates that the central bank sets. Usually money market products yield a very similar interest rate depending on the exact situation, and usually at very slight fluctuations of value, right? So it's not very risky. So either money market products that are currently still yielding around 3%, but you have to search around. That's not a savings account because big banks won't just offer this to you on a silver platter. So you can search for a money market portfolio, or look for some money market mutual funds, or look for an ETF solution. Even Finax has this one ETF money market solution that yields around 3% currently. So that can be a good place to store your emergency fund. Or oftentimes, many of my colleagues just hold it in a mixed portfolio of bonds and stocks. We will talk in the investing topic a lot about how you can mix bonds and stocks to make the portfolio less risky than investing in just stocks, which is usually risky. And these mixed portfolios, let's say 50% bonds and 50% stocks, they have some fluctuations, but they manage to match inflation over most periods, right? So the likelihood is high. The reason why you can allow yourself to risk a bit is that usually you don't need your entire emergency fund immediately at once, right? Usually either when you lose your job, you can stretch it out over a longer period of time, or the emergencies that just don't take as much money as 3, 4, 5 months of your monthly expenses, right? Usually they are slightly cheaper. So when your portfolio or your emergency fund declines by 5%, that shouldn't be that much of an issue. Inflation has the potential to erode it much more than that, right? To finish this topic, I just wanted to show you a little table. This illustrates a general point. Oftentimes, people think or tend to underestimate the power of savings when it comes to building wealth, right? We usually think that we need to maximize the profit that and return that we earn with our investments. That's why we see a lot of even young people or older people trying to trade stocks or cryptocurrencies because they believe that they need to, earn a massive return in order to become rich from, from young age, right, and quickly. Not only that is super risky, and we will talk about that in the investing topic, because you can gamble away all your savings very easily if you just bet on cryptocurrencies or on stocks, but it also isn't very effective if you save and invest only a small portion of your wealth. And that can be seen in this table. Look at this arrow. Let's say we start from the top left corner. The rows, the lower you go, the more you earn as a return. So the more successful you are at picking stocks or betting or on whatever you want, right? The lower you move, the more successful your investing profit is. The one to the right, yes, is there a question, Josef? I can see that your hand is raised.
Yeah, I don't see the presentation, so I'm just checking if...
Can everyone still see the presentation?
It shows up, yes.
Yeah, we see it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
okay, so it's my fault. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, Joshko maybe reconnect or something like that.
Yeah. Maybe try refreshing or something. It also shows to me that it should be still presenting. Okay. So back to the... Wait, sorry, I can see and I can hear an echoes. Sorry. Okay. So the lower you go, the more successful your investment. But the more you go to the right, the more you save, right? We assume that you have an annual income of 15,000 euros. And the more you go to the right, the higher the percentage you save per year, right? So those are annual savings, that 150 euros over the entire year or 1,500 euros over the entire year. So you still have to divide that by 12 to get to the amount that you set aside monthly, right? And you can see that even if we go from the top left corner to the right side, we get to a much higher amount than by boosting our annual return. So that is to illustrate that often people are chasing around the wrong metric to begin with. Even if you're a very, very good investor, earning 10% or more, but you don't put enough money, you don't save and set aside enough money, you just save 150 euros per year, you won't get very rich, even if you are genuinely a magnificent and very skillful investor, right? So the first prerequisite for getting rich by investing is to get your savings rate in order and to save at least those 10%. Because oftentimes, even if you don't earn much, but manage to boost your saving rate from 1 to 10%, which is not unrealistic for many people or for most people, you would get to a higher wealth than by trying to, invest very successfully. And you would get that without risk, right? Because once you save that money and invest it even conservatively, right, you're not undergoing as much risk as trying to bet on the most successful stocks. There you risk losing everything, even the 150 euros that you save, right? So oftentimes having a sufficient savings rate is a prerequisite if you want to build a large wealth that will take care of you more so than being a very, very successful investor, right? That is the reason why this is super important and why we talk about this topic before we delve into investing. So that would be for the first topic. The second topic will be about investing. Before that, feel free to ask questions on the table on anything that I covered. We can spend roughly 10 minutes discussing your questions. Yes, I see that there's a question.
Yeah, I missed it, but in the table, it was like, there was no time period of saving.
Yeah, I'm sorry. There was, but I forgot to put it into the title. It's 30 years.
30 years, okay, good.
It's 30 years, so this is lifelong investing.
Okay, good.
Yes, it's a very good remark. I have to add it there. But this is annual investment of this period for 30 years. So it simulates what for most people can, for example, be retirement saving, right? Just setting aside a portion of their income over their productive life from, let's say, 30 until 60.
And the annual rate is average, like over those 30 years.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
The annual rate of return is the investment profit that you earn on average in each year. So that's a simplified assumption, but it appreciates by 5%, let's say, If you're in the row with 5%, then it appreciates it by 5% in every year of those 30 years.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. That was a very good remark. Anything else you would like to ask? Slido or in person? By theory, I'm supposed to leave at least 1 to 2 minutes for this. But if there are no immediate questions, then you can still think about your questions, and we can have a longer Q&A session after we finish all the 3 topics. If there are no questions directly on this, feel free to think about them. Or Maciej, is there a question? I can see you're speaking, but I can't hear you. That's weird. Can you check whether you have a proper mic set up in the microphone
sorry.
setting? Yeah.
Can
Now I can hear you.
okay.
Thank you.
Could you please post Slido link again
Oh, of course.
for those who connected later?
Yeah. So it doesn't share the chat history before you connected, right? Because we had it in the chat, but I was unsure whether it will also reshare the chat history for everyone who joins later.
Thanks.
Can you see it now? Perfect. No worries. Okay, so if there are no questions, let's have a 7-minute break and continue at 10:40. I will, in the meantime, prepare the presentation for the other topic, and you can, again, go to the bathroom, get coffee, get water, snacks, whatever you need, and we will continue at 10:40. So that is when we will start with the topic of investing, and the second block will cover everything about the long-term investing we were talking about. So you can invest in what is the investment risk, how to set up a portfolio for different financial goals. So thank you very much for listening for this presentation, and see you at 10:40. I guess you can stay connected and we can just mute our microphones and cameras to make the transition more smooth afterwards. Thank you. Okay, it's 10:40. We can slowly start to move on so that we manage to present all the topics or go through everything that I prepared for you today. Great. So the second block we will discuss today will be about investing. That is usually the topic that interests people the most. So let's look at a lot of data and everything that we have prepared about this. I promised to tell you, or when I was explaining why personal finance is an important topic to think about, I mentioned that oftentimes Europeans tend to sort of underexplore the world of investing. We tend to focus on cash or deposits in the banks or banking products, maybe some insurance policies, but don't hold much money into in other forms of investments. And that is why I wanted to start this presentation by giving you a more major overview of the world of investing. When you think about investments, you might have heard that you usually build a portfolio. That is, you build a pool of investments that you essentially purchase. You can think about this like building Lego, right? You have a lot of building bricks and you build some more major structure that looks like something from it, right? And the first question you need to understand when you want to invest is, what are these Lego bricks? Well, what can you compose portfolios or larger structures? What is the material that you can build from when you are building an investment portfolio? We call these Lego bricks asset classes. So those are some very small units of investments that you can buy and that are supposed to generate some income for you. There are several basic ones. The first of them are called stocks. You probably heard this word at some point. Stocks represent ownership stakes in companies. So when a company issues or has stocks, when you own a stock, you own a particular percentage, usually a small one, of a company that is somewhere traded on a stock exchange, right? Usually, ownership comes with two rights. The first right is the right to participate in profits. This is the most important. There are even laws for this, that most shareholders need to have the same claim for profits. So whenever a company makes some money in a particular year, its shareholders essentially own that profit. And they can get that profit in two ways. And that is essentially, these two ways are the ways in which income from stocks is generated. The first way is that the company pays out a dividend. So the company evaluates that it doesn't want to keep this money within the company, so it just distributes a payment of profit to its shareholders. Many large and established companies do this regularly, right? Each quarter they pay out some money. So this is a very direct way in which shareholders can get to their money. Now, the second way, a little less intuitive, but also more common, is that companies don't pay out all of their profits, but decide to keep some of that money within the company to reinvest it. Reinvest it can mean to do whatever to expand its activities and earn more in the future. It can mean if you're a car maker, an automobile company, you can open a new factory somewhere. It can mean expanding into a new country. It can mean investing into a development of a new product if you are a tech company, or to hire new people to do more marketing in the future, right? All of these can be investments for which you can use past profits for. The reason why this still benefits shareholders is that if companies grow and have more factories and have more research spending and have more marketing budgets, usually they are considered by other investors who don't own the company yet as more valuable. They think that the profits are likely to increase in the future, so they want to get in now in order to get a claim in those profits, right? To reap the profits, which will increase later on because of investments today. So that means that the stock price will be increasing because there will be sort of more interest. People will be willing to pay more for this stock to get a share in the profits because they expect the profits to rise, right? So usually when a company makes profits, shareholders earn money. So that would be the first right, right for profits, right? The second right that comes with stock ownership is right to participate in voting in the company. So there are often general shareholder meetings where stockholders can vote. However, for some types of stocks, and even for many types of investments that are available to ordinary people. So we will be talking about mutual funds or ETFs. You don't really vote because you just own that stock indirectly through a bank, a mutual fund, or an ETF, and that company keeps the voting right. So you don't really need to be bothered with studying things about the company and voting, right? It's also not mandatory, to be fair. So, but these are usually the two rights that come with it. Now, the important thing about stocks, and an important idea that we will be mentioning here, is that usually stocks are riskier than other forms of investments, but they also have higher returns. And that is due to the simple fact that their value is derived from profits of companies, from profitability, right? So on one hand, there is no ceiling on profits. If there is a successful company, its profits can grow indefinitely for very long periods of time. In that respect, there is no ceiling on how much you can get, right? That is why the expected return is relatively high, because for successful companies, you won't stop receiving more money after a certain period of growth, right? There is no cap. However, profits are also super uncertain and they don't have to happen, right? Companies can make profits, but they can also lose a lot of money. They can have unlucky years and everything. And in those years, stock prices will go down because there are no profits. You won't get any money. And that is why stocks fluctuate in value, right? When there are bad years, they go down. When there are good years and companies grow, they go up. And that is why we call them risky. The riskiness refers to the fact that they fluctuate sharply up and down and that there is no success guaranteed with them, right? The second type of Lego brick that you can use to construct your portfolio are so-called bonds. Now, bonds, unlike stocks, don't represent ownership. They are a loan. It's a loan packaged in a security, right? This means that imagine I'm a government or a company that needs money and wants to borrow it. And for some reason, I decide to borrow it in the financial markets from normal people who have money, right? Then I write a contract. I call it a bond, right? And I sell this contract. So because I sell it, I receive some money for it. And I can use this money for whatever I need. I borrowed because I need money, right? Now, this contract means that whoever owns that piece of paper, that bond, is entitled to receive some regular payments from me. These regular payments are called interest or coupon payments, right? So just like you repay your loan, governments and companies also repay these bonds by sending these regular coupon payments. And then usually this paper has a certain maturity. So it is issued for a fixed period of time, which can really range. It can be from 3 months to 30 years, even more. So it's really very individual. You can write up a bond for any period. This period is called maturity period. Just think about your mortgage, right? Or your loan. It also has a certain maturity. You borrow for 20, 30 years. You borrow for 8 years, maybe when you are buying a car on a consumer loan or something like that, right? You always have that fixed period. And once this period finishes, the issuer pays off a larger payment, so-called face value, that is usually very similar to the price that they originally borrowed, right? And they repay that, and the bond ceases to exist. It just is, it just disappears from the world. This is the concept of maturity. So you get the borrowed amount or the money that you paid at the beginning back at the end, and you also get some interest, coupon payments, regular payments on top to be rewarded for the willingness to lend to that company or to that government, right? So that is how the income is generated, from coupon payments, from face value repayment at the end. Now, bonds are not riskless. This is a very important point, right? When you invest in bonds, you can still lose money due to several factors, but mainly because no one guarantees that a company will not go bankrupt and be unable to pay off it. That's right. When bankruptcies happen, they usually happen because company just lost too much money and doesn't have money, doesn't have wealth to pay its creditors, to pay back what it owes, right? So that can still happen, and bankruptcy still endanger bondholders and happen, especially if the economy is doing really bad, right? However, they are safer than stocks. Why? First of all, because their income is not derived from profits. Usually companies try to make bond payments even if they are not making profits, or even if they are in red numbers or their size is declining. The reason is that if they go bankrupt, the current shareholders will lose the right to control the company. The ownership of the company is then usually transferred to creditors. So that is banks that have loans against it, that is bondholders and everyone like that. And those creditors can just decide whatever they want to do with that company. They can keep it operating and try to squeeze some money out of its, operations, make it profitable, or they can just say that this company now stops to exist and we are selling off all its wealth in order to recover at least a portion of what we are owed, right? So in that case, you don't get 100% of what you were promised, but maybe 40, maybe 50, right? You get a portion of your money back, but not the full, and you're still at a loss with the bond, but in a much smaller loss than stockholders, because those not only stocks decline in price usually already when the company is making lower profits than before, right? So it can still be paying its bondholders, but stock value can be declining because profits are not rising or are declining, right? And if there is a bankruptcy, stockholders have literal zero because they lose the company. They just don't own it anymore. Whereas bondholders can recover a portion of their money because they get control of the company. So that is why, while bonds are still risky, they are less risky than stocks. Their value usually fluctuates less sharply up and down. And, instances where they would get zero are also, there's a lower probability of them, right? So in a portfolio, this means that bonds earn a lower return because their reward is capped. I mentioned that stock, there is no upper limit on profits, but for bondholders, they can get a maximum of what was promised, right? The face value and the coupon payments. If the company grows to 1,000 times its original size, they will just get the cap, the maximum of what they were promised. So there is usually lower growth, but the fluctuations up and down, the way it rises and maybe falls when the economy is doing bad, are less severe than with stocks, right? That is why we call them a lower yielding, but a less risky alternative of stocks. And then the last Lego brick that you can use is a very wide category called alternative investments. So alternative investments are called alternative because they are investments that are traded and can be bought or sold at markets other than the traditional stock and bond markets. The stock and bond markets are called traditional because they are the most developed. They usually have the most money flowing within them. They have the most regulatory oversight. They have the most legal precedent of some legal protection and similar things, right? So those have the most money, most participant. It's the easiest to enter them, but and they are also much more regulated for protection of investors. Alternative investments are a very wide range of various investments that don't get that many participants and that much regulatory oversight. So those can be real estate, either real estate funds or purchasing investment properties directly on a mortgage and then renting it out to someone. Those can be precious metals such as silver or gold. It can be about commodities. So that is all the things that you hear when you hear about sophisticated investing in US hedge funds, such as trading futures on oil or on some agricultural produce, or it can be cryptocurrencies, a very popular form of investment in the past couple of years. Their income is generated in a variety of ways. It can be rent, it can be price gains, it can be whatever, however that works. It's a very flexible and wide category. Now, another important lesson to learn today is that there is usually a relationship between risk and return. Usually when you undergo more risk, so the risk is the risk, first of all, that the value of your investment will fluctuate up and down very sharply, and that the declines in the value during economic crises or when something bad happens will be deeper. But usually when you undergo more risk, you also have to have a higher expected return, a higher mechanism that means that if the investment is successful, you will ultimately not have a cap on your price gain, and you will earn more than, for example, with a loan or something like that. When the risk is relatively low, but the return, expected return or potential return is also relatively low, we call these defensive assets. Those are used to defend ourselves, right? So to reduce the fluctuations in the value, reduce the possible amount that we can lose. Before I move on, yes, Rastislav, is there a question?
Shimon wants to ask. Yeah.
Yes, actually, I wanted to ask something about the previous slide.
Of course, go ahead.
You said that you cannot really go higher than what was promised at the beginning, if I understood it correctly.
Yeah.
But when you have a loan from a bank, right, what happens is that after 5 or 10 years, depending on your agreement, then they might hire their own interest because they might feel like the loan should be more expensive. So I would assume that this would happen also on the bonds market. So if this would happen, then the bank which owns the loan from firm or government is going to increase their interest. Isn't that going to reflect positively on you as a bonds owner?
That is a very good question. Actually, when you have a single bond, that cannot happen. You cannot change. Maybe you can have some contracts which have adjustable interest rates, but oftentimes bonds are just issued with a fixed interest rate and that doesn't change. What usually happens, so that companies or governments protect themselves against this, is that the repayment period, the maturity, isn't set for a very long period, but it is set for a, 6-month period or for a couple of years. So when interest rates change, the maturity of the old bonds sort of stops to exist, and the new bonds that it issues, many companies or governments just roll over their debt. They issue bonds with a iron frequency, right? They issue bonds either every half year or once in a quarter or once in 2 years or something like that. They often do new issues very frequently. When you look at governments, you will find that several times in a year new bonds are issued, right? So they roll it over into newly existing bonds, and that will already reflect the interest rates that are on the market, right? So yes, when you are, for example, investing regularly, so you are a regular bond investor and you always, monthly buy new bond issues, then if, for example, interest rates decline, you might get rolled over. Your new money might be coming into bonds that yield lower percentages, right? And similarly, if interest rates increase, you can get rolled over into new bonds that have higher percentages. So it can be positive. But there is one other mechanism. I didn't really want to cover it here because it's relatively more advanced, but it is called interest rate risk. So whenever interest rates, for example, increase, and this means that new bonds now carry a higher interest, right? If you buy a newly issued bond, you will get a higher interest than half a year ago. Then the older bonds, suddenly people don't really want to buy the older bonds, right? They want to sell them and move into the new ones because they have higher interest, because why would they hold the old ones? So that usually means that the price of the old ones decreases in order to allow people to buy it for a lower price. And, with the fixed payments, with the same repayments as before, you can get a higher interest because now you can get it at a discounted price, right? You pay less for it, but you still get the original promised payments. The promised payments don't decline, right? So that is usually what happens when interest rate rise. And therefore, usually we hear that when interest rates increase, the price of bonds decreases. And similarly, when interest rates decrease, so the new bonds are not very attractive and everyone wants to own the old bonds, their prices usually increase because there's a higher interest, and that sort of pushes down the effective interest that you get on them if you purchase them for the higher price, right? So on the other hand, the lower the interest rates get, the higher the price of bonds get, especially of the old bonds, right? So there, if you want to, for example, hold a bond until maturity, so there is a 10-year bond and you want to hold it until maturity, its price will fluctuate as interest rates in the economy change. And this is no problem to you if you hold it for a 10-year period, right, until maturity, because you get the entire original promised payment. That usually doesn't change. So you get the entire original promised payment, then nothing happened. But if you sell it before maturity, so you had a 10-year bond, but sell it after 3 years, and interest rates have gone up in the meantime, you will be penalized because the price of your bond declined due to the rise in the interest rates. Similarly, if you sell it after 3 years and it's a 10-year bond, then usually you would gain a lot because the price of your bond would increase. That is so-called interest rate risk. So that is why when you are investing in bonds, it's usually good to match your intended investment period with the maturity of the bonds, because the payments usually stay the same. So if you hold it for that period, then you can usually forecast kind of accurately what percentage you will gain. But if you invest into long-term bonds and intend to hold them for 2 years, so a 10-year bond for 2 years, you risk that interest rates will increase in the meantime and you will lose a lot of money because it will decline. So this is how it usually works. The interest rates can change, but because the price of the bond, the price for which you can buy and sell it, changes, not because the promised payments change. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. We will actually be getting to bonds very, very soon. But back to this idea of risk. Daniel, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. I actually have a question about bonds, but maybe we're going to get to it. But yeah, I just wanted to ask, Since bonds are less risky than stocks,
Yeah.
I believe it's generally recommended to shift your portfolio from stocks to bonds when you get older. I'm thinking about my dad. He's almost 60, and he owns mostly stocks. So, is there any recommendation? When is the right time to shift the portfolio from stocks to bonds?
Ooh, this is an amazing question. Yes, this is so-called life cycling strategy. So, life cycling strategy usually as you approach retirement, usually 10 years before retirement or something like that, you start shifting slowly a portion of your portfolio into bonds. Wow, it's really difficult to say an exact number, right?
Yeah.
Because I would need to run a lot of calculations and I don't know any specific rule. For example, when we have our European pension, so the retirement product I will be talking about, the one we developed under European Union oversight, that one does it very gradually, like it's automatically, we do it. We increase the percentage by minor percentage points essentially every month as you approach retirement once that time comes. And we then start shifting into bonds from 10 years before retirement, but it's suboptimal to do it on your own in this way because you would incur a lot of trading costs if you were doing it by very small steps, right? So usually from our algorithms, for example, we calculated the algorithms of how much bonds and stocks you should have for different investment horizons. So if your dad is 60, that probably means he wants to retire by 65 in 5 years. That correct?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah. So for 5 years, that's usually the horizon is usually recommended for like 60-40 portfolio, 60% in stocks and 40% in bonds. But the thing to realize here is that you won't spend all of that money at 65, right? You are expected today. Of course, it's highly uncertain, but if you live until 65, you are expected to live 19 years in retirement currently with the current numbers. For women, it's even slightly more, I believe. So your true investment horizon is that you want to draw that money down over a 20-year horizon. That's still a very long horizon, right? You can still allow to take some risk in order to appreciate that money a bit, and you can extract larger final pension from it. I will talk about that in the retirement topic a lot. So this is the so-called concept of a payout portfolio, right? So you don't hold your retirement savings in cash for 20 or 25 years. That doesn't make any sense. Inflation would erode a lot of your retirement savings, right? So usually people just swap it into a 60-40 portfolio at the time when they retire, and they draw annual income from that portfolio, right? They always, at the beginning of the year, they sell off a portion and they use it to have some income. And for those 15, 20 years, they are still taking some risks because they can afford that, right? If your portfolio, when you're 65, declines by 15%, zero problem for you. You will be needing the last 15% in 15 years or 17 years, right? You don't need it at 65. So it's good to stay invested. Usually 60-40 portfolios are recommended when you are in retirement and drawing passive income. And before that, oftentimes when people are reaching financial independence, and so on, they even hold it in 100% stocks until 65. But perhaps for the last 5 years, you can shift into 80-20. I would probably do it personally. I don't have very strong numbers for that. It's something between 60-40 and 100% stocks, because that is sort of you want to get from 100% stocks to 60-40, and you want to hold 60-40 in retirement. So maybe something in the middle of that, maybe 80-20 sounds reasonable to me. So while there is a reason to have some bonds to mitigate the chance of a very significant decline, if the 2008 crisis comes again, you might find yourself with half your retirement savings gone by the time you're 65, and that might be problematic and stressful. So, but no need to overdo it and hold, for example, only bonds, because you have to realize that the withdrawal horizon is still pretty long. It's probably 2 decades or roughly 25 years, 23 years for your father. So I would say right now 80-20 sounds reasonable to me.
Yeah, thank you.
No worries. We'll get to that. You'll see more numbers when and one academic study. What are the hedging products to compensate a possible decrease in stock market when the recovery time is sometimes very long? We are getting to that. Usually bonds are very reasonable, right? Let me get to that. I have that in 2 slides. But thank you for the questions. They are really amazing. So the problem is that defensive assets like bonds and cash, because they are not very risky, but they have lower potential returns, they are good for shorter term investing, right? So for money that you know you will need within a short period of time. Imagine you want to do a larger renovation in your house, and you know you want to do it in 2 or 3 years, right? And you know that you don't want to postpone it by another 4 years if the stock market tanks and you need to wait a couple of years so that it recovers, right? So that is where defensive assets, interest-bearing assets, are useful. They are for shorter-term investing. The issue here is that Europeans often also use them for very long-term goals. They use them for goals when they can allow some risk in order to earn a higher return. So oftentimes, even for retirement, for example, people in Europe were invested in portfolios that consisted of 60-65% bonds, right? And that is the reason why many third pillar savings in Europe, in Slovakia, in second and third pillar, but also across Europe, barely managed to match inflation over the past 10, 15, 20 years. And that is terrible because the stock markets, as in general, fluctuated a lot over that period, and there were significant declines, but earned much, much more and appreciated wealth much, much more than bonds. And that is a pity because you lose out on tens of thousands of potential retirement income or of potential money that could have financed the university education of your kids, right? So it's a pity not to use them when you can use them. So the riskier investments are used for long periods. Usually we say that stocks are good from at least 10 years, right? So for shorter periods, you should have some bonds, but it's a pity not to utilize them, right? So we will talk about the nature of risk in stocks later on. But the thing is that while defensive assets can be used, it's a pity to overuse them for everything in your life, right? But before I jump to stocks, let me spend a couple of minutes talking about the defensive assets and when they are reasonable. So for example, one idea that I wanted to express related to the cash part, right? So to the very most defensive assets, is that right now, theoretically, you should be earning a lot of interest even on cash, even on completely riskless investments that just don't involve any risk. That is just, a savings account, imagine, right? The problem is that especially bigger banks that sort of have very good marketing and everything, and people are sort of opening accounts in them just because everyone has accounts in them, which is reasonable, but, gives them an edge, just didn't increase interest rates either at all or very little, right? Think about it. Right now, the interest rate set by the European Central Bank is 3.5%. That is how much banks can earn on risk-free deposits that they just, they just do a 24-hour deposit into the European Central Bank. No risk. I don't think European Central Bank would lose all its money within 1 day, right? That's probably an unimaginable scenario, right? So it's just the saving account they have in the ECB, and they can earn 3.5% of that. How much are you getting on your savings account? There are some banks, especially usually smaller ones, that are paying out decent interest rates. Yesterday, we were talking about the fact that, not yesterday, at the end of last week, I had this webinar, and we were talking that, for example, FIO Bank in Slovakia or even Revolut are paying decent, or not zero interest rates, right, on their savings accounts. But if you think about it, many banks don't, right, because they don't have the competition. And that is the pity, because there are ways to also earn interest on cash nowadays. Idea number one, search for a bank that just offers a better interest rate. Many of my friends have Revolut, savings accounts. There are some smaller banks in your country probably which might offer a high interest savings account, right? Second way to do this are very, very conservative money market investment solutions. Money market usually refers to bonds that have maturities shorter than 1 year. So these are, micro loans for a couple of months, but you can also have them for 24 hours, as I said. And currently there are also ETFs. They are so-called overnight ETFs. You can also note this down if you want to research it. And overnight ETFs essentially replicate the interest rate offered by the European Central Bank. They do it in a sort of complicated manner, but that is not important. The thing is that they are able to pay out around 3.3, 3.4% interest rate, very close to the ECB rate currently. And they paid out every day, which is the value of those ETFs just goes up in almost a straight line. The fluctuations are almost zero. Finax has also designed a product built on these ETFs. It's called the Smart Deposit. So that one is paying out a very similar interest rate. You can check it out on our website. But I'm not here to promote products. So if you want, you can check out the competition. But the thing is, money market overnight ETFs, right, can also help you replicate this, and they can be a better alternative to savings rates. So even with cash, you should do some research because currently it yields high interest. Then we come to bonds, right? And this is where the question about the hedging products from Slido comes useful, right? So when to use bonds in your portfolios? Bonds just will smooth out the fluctuations of your portfolio. They will decrease the expected, declines when economy is doing bad. They will probably make your portfolio fluctuate less sharply up and down on every day or every week or every month basis, right? It will make the growth smoother, but they also decrease the expected return on your portfolio, right? So when it is reasonable to use them is when you are cautious, so when you just don't want to see the fluctuations in your portfolio. This can be either because you just have a preference for that, right? So many people just don't like risk and don't want to risk. Although for retirement purposes, I will try to convince you that there is nothing much to, fear too much of. But some people just don't want to see risk. Some people have shorter horizons, right? So that's when, as I said, for example, you have money for your kid, but you know that you want to send them the money when they are at the university, right? And they're leaving for university in 5 years, right? That is not unlimited horizon. If the stock markets decline by the time they are leaving your house, that's not good. You don't have that much money for them, right? So you want to have that money available in a couple of years. In general, we have tested a lot of historical data and so on, and we have developed these intuitive rules, right? So when your goal is less than 3 years away, use this. Use money market products, right? Use high interest things, overnight ETFs or something like that, or bonds that have maturities shorter than 3 years, right? Use ETFs and things centered around that. If your goal is 3 to 10 years away, you can afford to have stocks in your portfolio, but you should mix it with bonds, right? So that is where you compose different mixtures, like 40% bonds and 60% stocks and similar things. You can mix it in any proportion you want. If you can't run the calculations yourself, right, which is very understandable and most people can't, that is where companies such as Finax come to help, right? That is the reason we exist. We are so-called robo-advisors. So that is a new type of company where you just fill in an investment questionnaire, which will ask you all these things. It will ask you for how long do you intend to invest? What is your financial goal? How much money do you need by the time you want to pay for that goal and all of that. And it will run the calculations and recommend an optimal split of bonds and stocks for you, right? To maximize the chance that you are successful at finishing your goal and you are safe by the time the investment horizon passes, right? So robo-advisors can help. Not to just promote Finax, we have a lot of competition. There is, for example, Porto in the Central European markets. There are other robo-advisors from more Western states, which can also help you. So that is where it can help. For longer-term goals, so for ones that are more than 10 years away, just invest in stocks. That is where you don't have to be afraid of the stock market. We'll see why later on. And the last point, and that is what answers the Slido question about the hedging products, is that it's sort of having bonds in your portfolios is often functions sort of as a hedge against stock market declines. So in many instances, when stocks decline and when the stock market is in a decline, bonds tend to rise, or at least not fall as much. But oftentimes they even tend to rise. This is because of the so-called flight to safety or flight to quality phenomenon. And that is that many times bonds are issued by governments or are issued by more mature companies, or in general, companies try to pay them even if they don't have profits, as I said, right? So many people consider bonds to be safer in times of crisis. They panic and they shift a lot of their funds into bonds. And that causes bond prices to increase because there is now extra demand for them, right? Whenever a lot of people want to buy something, its price increases, and that functions for bonds as well, right? So oftentimes, when panic happens, stocks decline, but bonds rise slightly. So that, if you have both of them in your portfolio, it sort of smooths out, hedges, as we say in finance, hedges the decline, right? So this can also function. Beware that this doesn't happen always. Flight to safety doesn't always happen. There are crises where both bonds and stocks decline. For example, that happened during the last crisis when there was the energy crisis, war in Ukraine and everything. Stocks went down, but because interest rates were rising, and as I said, rising interest rates often push down bonds for a certain period of time. So bonds were also declining. But usually, even if they both decline, bonds decline less. So that, the hedging is not perfect, but it happens often. And that is why we mix it in when we need to be safer with our investment. Okay, that's about bonds. Now, let's get to goals that are more than 10 years away. That can be saving for the start of your life for your kids if they are 3 years old, or retirement, or anything else that is more than 10 years away. So with that, we recommend pure stock investments. Why? Because stocks are and historically have been the most reliable asset class to beat inflation by a solid wide margin. So here in this graph, you can see a comparison of growth of various asset classes from 1926 until the end of 2020. You can see stocks, bonds, gold, real estate, cash, but cash that is earning the interest rates that the central banks have set. So like cash handled wisely. And this is sort of, we take the growth from 1926 to 2020 and we compute the average growth per year, right? So in some years, they might have declined by 30%. In other years, they might have grown by 25 or by 2%. You just take the average over that very long, almost 100-year time period, right? And you can see that stocks grew by far the most and beat inflation of 2.9% very reliably. By the way, this is US data, but it functions very similarly in other comparisons, right? One very, very important point to make here. This is not about picking individual stocks. This is not NVIDIA. This is not ExxonMobil. This is not Microsoft, Tesla, anything else that you know from the stock market. This is holding the stock market in general. What do I mean by that? When you hold the stock market as such, you essentially try to hold as much companies that are out there as possible, right? You try to hold hundreds or ideally thousands of companies that are traded across the world or in a specific region, right? Without trying to speculate on which ones are likely to succeed, which ones you like most, which ones have the best management, nothing. You just buy as much as possible. You try to buy a sample that sort of represents the value of the whole market. And this is a great way to diversify. So if something happens to one company, you don't lose all your money, but it's also a way to secure these numbers. Many people might be asking, and it also, I like this other chart because while this shows one number over a period, this shows the distribution. It's a logarithmic scale. So normally it would be growing in sort of a U shape or the right side of a U. But that's not important, right? Like the mathematics of constructing this graph is not important. What this graph shows is that the growth is and has been relatively persistent. Look at this. This is a US index called S&P 500. So it's the 500 largest companies in the US, but they are active throughout the world usually. But it's not a global investment. It's an investment of a very large region. But it's hundreds of large companies traded in the US, and it's 200 years of development. It's 1824. The reason we are using an US index and not like the whole world is that we just don't have that long data for other regions. But to emphasize this fact that this growth has been pretty stable, so it just occurred. The stock market grew in value over the past 200 years. You might be asking why. What does guarantee or what is the underlying mechanism? What could explain the fact that the stock market grows in the long run? The simple explanation is that, as I said, stock value is usually derived from profitability. Usually, and it's not one-to-one. It doesn't mean that if profits increase by 20%, stocks will increase by 20% in the same period in 6 months or something like that. But in the long run, if the profitability and the total profits of largest companies in the world increase, the stock market tends to follow it. The value of stocks also tends to increase because stocks are just a right to participate in that profit. If there is more profit to get from stocks, investors are just willing to pay more for it. The value of stocks increases, right? And this is usually true, especially over very long periods of time, right? And the thing is that due to the nature of our economy and due to the nature of humans, the profitability of companies as such usually increases because we have new inventions, right? Whenever there is a new technological development or whenever there is a new machine that allows us to do things quicker and at cheaper cost than before, then the profitability of companies increases and the stocks increase because from every euro that the companies spend, they are able to extract more money and earn more profits, right? So the profitability and the value of the stock market then increases. It is also because the educational levels of the humanity are increasing. When you think about countries such as even, we're starting in 1824. Compare how many people globally had access to high school or university education, just could attend in 1824 and today. It's much, much more, right? And even today, it's still increasing, right? Think about countries like India, where every year you pull more people up to the middle class and allow them to at least access high school education, which usually means that they don't have to work on a field or be unemployed, but they can work a job that is more productive, that sort of produces more money per money invested into it, right? Something more sophisticated, something that is more advanced, right? And that is when economies grow and profitability of Indian companies grows and the value of the global stock market again increases, right? So as educational rates, as technological inventions and everything, as humanity progresses, stock market's value usually follows. That is the underlying mechanism. But you can't be betting on individual stocks because the thing is, when you're betting on individual stocks, anything can happen to one company. One company can go bankrupt and you lose all your money because when a company goes bankrupt, its stock price usually tanks to zero and you're done. Like you don't own anything there, right? But it's very unlikely that all companies globally go bankrupt, right? They can all struggle at the same time, and we will talk about stock market declines, but usually the value of the aggregate economy is growing because of growing profitability over the long run. That should in order for the global economy to stop existing, that would have to be an unimaginable catastrophe. And if that happened, you would likely, the value of your portfolio would likely be the last thing that you would be worried about because there would be larger problems in your life right then, probably. But so this is the growth, but not to be only overly optimistic, this does come at a price. And the price are declines. So as I said, profitability, while it grows in the long run, we can probably be relatively certain or say that there's a relatively high probability that in 30 years' time, society will be more productive than today. And there will be inventions that we can't even imagine today. Just think about the world before ChatGPT or something like that, right? But in the short run, so over a period of couple of years, profits go up and down. They just change with everything. Consumer preferences, price of oil, wars, whatever, right? Whatever that happens. So there are often declines in the stock market. In this graph, you can see that there are these red dots below the graph. They show the maximum decline into which the stock market has gotten in that specific year. And you can see that oftentimes in many years, this reaches 20, 10% almost always, but 20, 30, in some very bad years, even 40%, right? So it's completely possible that within 1 year, you will lose half of your money in the stock market because of a decline. However, when you combine this, so these declines, and they can last for a couple of years, right? We can have a couple of years of declines in a row, right? However, when you combine it with this graph, you can see that always when you invest into the stock market in general, the crises are always overcome. That's again because humans, although we tend to be pessimistic about ourselves, we usually tend to find solutions for crises and bad times often get over, right? So while there can be declines, usually the stock market recovers and goes back to growth, right? And you can sort of see that on the blue line. So the blue lines here, they represent the final return, the final profit with which the index, the stock market has ended that particular year, right? And in most years, it's blue. So it often happens in investing that you have a decline of 15% within 1 year and still end the year with profit, right? Because it just recovers so quickly. But sometimes you can see that the blue lines are negative. That means that there was a loss in that particular year. So declines happen. Many times, most times, they are very short run. Sometimes they are longer. They last a couple of years. The most recent one was when the great inflation and energy prices and the war in Ukraine started, and there was a decline for 2 years. You would be looking at, at red numbers for 2 years in the stock market. And many times it can be even longer. That is why I said that if you invest, it's good to have at least a 10-year horizon, so that if a major crisis hits and there is a decline that lasts 7, 8, 9 years, you are still good, right? And you have to count with it. So the thing I want to show you with these two graphs is that the fact that there are declines in the economy doesn't mean that the investment won't be successful. Quite the opposite. Usually investors such as Warren Buffett or someone, say that it is the price that comes with investing, that when you are starting to invest, you should expect that you will experience several declines of 20% or more in your life. That is something you should actually count on, because it just, you can't have profits without the fluctuations that come in profits, right? It's just how the investment works. However, that is why it's good not to, worry too much about what happens in the process, right? You might be in red numbers over a couple of years, but if you invest for a generation, for 20 years, the profitability increases so much that you will end up in a loss. And the worst thing that you could do is panic and sell it at the bottom and then miss out on the subsequent growth where the economy starts recovering and we emerge from the crisis. So the best approach really is to just keep buying and don't worry too much about what happens in the meantime, as long as you know that you are holding the stock market as such, so hundreds, thousands of global companies. This is a graph that illustrates development from 2009 until the end of 2021. So that's many years. And you can see that the stock market is again represented by the US index S&P 500, but we will talk about other regions of the world as well. Don't worry. You can see that it grew a lot. And what these little titles are and what they represent is bad news that happened in the meantime. So all of these are reasons to panic and sell your investment and believe that the economy is going to tank and that you are going to lose a lot of your money. Just read some of them. They are bad news. Oftentimes, growth continues nevertheless, because especially the more sophisticated investors in the market realize that it's often overblown. So that is the trick, right? When you read the media to access the information, you have to think about the fact that they have sort of incentives to over exaggerate how bad things are, because they oftentimes have, incomes and everything tied to how many clicks they have, how many people read their articles. And usually having a flashy article that is sort of panicky attracts people, because people want to read sensations. They want to be afraid for some reason, seek out drama, right? So there's a reason to panic in the media, but oftentimes it's not that as bad as it's, presented in the media. And many times when there is a panic, growth just continues because, investors, especially the more sophisticated ones like hedge funds or something like that, realize that in the long run, in a couple of years, that news is not likely to cause a catastrophe or something like that. So whenever there's panic in the media, just ignore it. Remember to stick to your investment horizon, and remember that you are investing for a generation and not for a couple of days. So even if a decline happens, then you just wait for recovery, right? What can happen when you try to predict the market and step out and sell your investment at times when you think it's going to decline and the times are bad, and you think, okay, let's now go to cash. We had a lot of that. I can tell you a story about it, actually. So, and you're like, okay, I'll wait in cash and come back when bad times are over. Usually what happens is that you miss a lot of good days, because usually the strongest stock market growth comes at some point after crises, when a lot of investors in the market at once realize that the situation is not as bad as we imagined it to be, and that the economy actually improved a lot or something like that over the period of pessimism. And when they get convinced of it, oftentimes stock markets just grow very rapidly in the months or years following a period of crisis, right? So if you get out and fail to notice this, and oftentimes you even think this way, it's now growing, but it will fall again because we, like bad things are coming. Analysts in the media are saying that a recession will come. So even if it's growing now, it will fall back. And then you try to, convince yourself of that belief and wait for a couple more months. And if it's still growing and doesn't fall back over that period, you miss a lot of good days, right? And that can reduce your final return a lot. This chart shows how much you would earn if you invested $10,000 in our index S&P 500 for 20 years until the end of 2022. So, and 2022, by the way, was a pretty bad year. So you're ending in a period of panic. But you can see that if you just stay invested, so that means 2002 you buy, you forget about it for 20 years, and then 2022 you take it out and use it for your spending. You can see that you earn a lot. If you miss just 10 best days, just 10, imagine how many days there are in 20 years. You miss just 10 best days, you cut your return by half. That shows that stock market growth is not stable. It is oftentimes concentrated into a couple of good days. And by missing it because you speculated and thought that, oh, now that growth is temporary, it's going to decline, you risk, losing a lot of money. And if you increase it to just missing 60 best days, which is still a very short period of time, a very low proportion, look at how low the return is, right? So oftentimes it can even push you into a loss, right? That is why you see all those disclaimers that when you open an account in eToro or XTB, you often have that small letters disclaimer that most people who just bet on stocks and try to predict what will happen in the market end up in a loss because you miss good days. And also if you bet just on individual stocks, then you are also exposed to the threat that the company won't be doing well. So that is why it's important not to speculate and stay invested. I have a good story about it. I see the question. I will defer that to the because I can see that in Slido there is a question about the difference between investing through a bank and investing through a brokerage like XTB. That is a very good question, and I will cover that. There is again this. Do you have any questions on this topic? Panel at the end of these slides, coming to that in 6 slides. So I will answer that there. But thank you very much for the question. So I have a cool story about this. Recently there was this crisis I mentioned related to the war in Ukraine and related to high inflation, high interest rates, everything like that, right? The economy wasn't doing bad and companies wasn't doing good and companies were doing bad, right? So there were declines. The bottom came in October 2023. After that, essentially since October 2023, there has been a record growth in the stock market. Like it was literally almost without declines. It was very, very stable and very rapid, right? So that is what I say by the fact that oftentimes very good days come after crises, right? And I remember that, before October, it oftentimes happened that stock markets grew and then fell back, right? That usually happens in crises. It just goes up and down without really going anywhere for a couple of months or years. And I remember that, when it was growing, after October, it started growing rapidly. There was a good inflation report from the US, which started it. And also like profitability of companies started being better. And I remember many voices from professionals in the media. I read how, Morgan Stanley is predicting that this is again a temporary rise because a recession hasn't come yet, and a formal recession has to come before a stock market decline is finished. So don't buy stocks now, right? Well, where did that go? There has been a year and a half of, not a year and a half. It's almost 2. No. A year. Okay, sorry. I told you bad info. Sorry. It wasn't October 2023. It was bottom in October 2022. That's what I wanted to say. So almost 2 years of very constant and stable growth now, despite you reading in the media that an apocalypse is going to come. And that is because no one can predict the future, not even the professionals oftentimes. Same with recently. A couple of months ago, at the beginning, around the half of summer, it was the end of July, beginning of August, there was a very rapid, quick decline in the stock market because everyone panicked for a bit. And again, you could read I remember one very particular Slovak medium, I'm not going to shame, but how they said that experts are talking about stock apocalypse. This is a title that I read on their Instagram in a post. I was like, Jesus. And you know how long that decline lasted? For a couple of days. Literally, it got recovered until the end of the month, and now we're now at the end of September, we're higher than we were before that brief decline happened, right? And that is when you read about the stock apocalypse. So really don't let these panics get too much into your head. But it isn't to say that all declines will be short. There will be declines that will last for 6, 7, 8 years, especially if you invest for lifetime. You will definitely experience those, but it is still not a reason to panic and sell your investments, because you can see that in the long run, they do beat inflation. You just need to give them enough time to recover, right? And this is all illustrated with this graph. This is a study by this company called Dalbar, which has access to brokerage accounts. So they have access to very high quality data about the way people select their stocks and trade in their portfolios and everything, right? And usually they can compare, just the development of holding the entire market. So that is what we said. You buy that index, which has that graph of growth, right? And has all its declines and crises. And if there is a crisis, you will be in red numbers for a couple of years and everything like that. And they often compare the final performance or the final return of that index to the average investor, the average person who buys and sells stocks and tries to exit the market before declines and jump back before it recovers and everything. And they compare the results. You can see that average investor earns much less than even stock bond portfolios or the index S&P 500 itself. So usually when you try to be smarter than the market, you try to exit in crises, come back, hold cash till times are bad, and then predict when it will start growing again. You will usually just lose money, and you would have done better if you just forgot about your investment and went to educate yourself so that you can get your pay rise and you can increase your savings rate, as I said, right? And that would also be probably less stressful and more pleasant for most people than looking at charts and ultimately failing, right? So, emotions, panic, greed, all these things, imperfect information compared to the guys on Wall Street, all of these factors lead us to make mistakes and to be wrong many times when we try to predict what will happen in the future. Ultimately, because there are other people who have more information and better computers than us, but also because the future just cannot be predicted. It's unpredictable, and no one can tell you what will happen, right? Even if they have a very, very good data, and even if they are very intelligent and smart, because future is just random, If you try to predict it, you're likely to be wrong. And that is what the concept of passive and active investing is, right? So I promised to introduce this concept of active and passive investing. Active investing is where you try to be smart, right? You try to, or smarter than the market, let's say. You try to select those couple of stocks, which are the companies that will own the future. You try to time the market, right? So you try to predict when some stocks will go down and you sell them then, and then you try to predict when they will grow and you buy them back, right? So you do all these active choices that are based to a certain extent on your ability to predict the future. Passive investing is just buying the entire market and waiting for 30 years, and there you go. So it's really similar. You don't trade, you don't make decisions, you eliminate emotions and you eliminate the judgment from investing. And that is, and for all the reasons that I described, right? Usually, what the data show is that this passive investing, in the vast majority of instances, is more successful than active investing. There is this study called SPIVA. It's produced by S&P Global. It's this company that also produces the S&P 500 index, rates companies by the likelihood of them repaying debt and something like that. So they have access to data on mutual funds, which are actively trading, right? Mutual funds usually try to, time their purchases and select a couple of stocks that will be most successful and everything like that. So they compare the performance of these mutual funds and they contrast it to just passive indexes, right? Passive indexes of the regions on which those mutual funds focus, right? So for example, if a mutual fund focuses on the US, they can compare it to S&P 500. If a mutual fund focuses on Europe, they can compare it to Stoxx 600, which is an index that tracks the value of European stock markets and stuff like that, right? And they find that usually between 95 to 97% of active investments earn less in the long run than just passive holding of the entire market. Long run, I mean at least 10 years, right? So over the course of 1, 2, 3 years, anything can happen, and oftentimes active investors will be more successful because there are winners and losers in the market in every year, and by definition, you will just hold the winners over short periods at some point, and you will earn more than the market who owns the losers and the winners together, right? But over long periods, such as 10 years, usually most active managers, and these are professionals. Mutual funds are not managed by random people. They are managed by people with degrees, with their certifications, with teams of analysts, with access to databases that are super expensive and everything like that. Yet very few of them manages to beat the market. That is why we usually say that passive investing, in our opinion, is the best approach, especially for common people, but also for anybody who wants to manage their money, right? Passive investing can usually be done through the so-called ETFs. These are exchange-traded funds. It's something like a mutual fund, but you can buy it normally on a stock exchange or through a robo-advisor like Finax. And their value usually just reflects the indexes we were talking about. So index is usually a sample of companies that represents the value of the entire market, right? For example, S&P 500 is a sample of 500 largest companies in the US, right? A very important thing that often people don't realize is that companies in indexes change over time, right? So there is a rule, right? Such as 500 largest companies in the US, or Stock 600 is 600 largest companies in Europe, right? You have this specific rule and you just apply it, once in a quarter or something like that, or once in a year. And you check what the current 500 largest companies are in that economy, right? So that means that in the 1980s, you had pretty much different companies from what you have now, right? In the 1980s, oil companies were dominating S&P 500. You can check that in the left corner. So most of that are oil companies. There is IBM, so computers. There is AT&T, so telecommunications. But much different than now. So when you look at 2020, you have tech companies mostly. So you have Apple, you have Microsoft, you have Meta and similar companies, Nvidia. Now much, in 2024, Nvidia is much higher on that hierarchy, right? So what an index ensures is that in every period, you will be holding the biggest companies that are sort of more successful. That is why they are among the biggest ones that are included in the indices, right? So you will always be participating on the tech giants or on the oil giants or the telecommunication giants of your time, regardless of what that company will be. And you know that with holding an index, with holding an ETF, those companies will automatically climb into your ETF, right? And will automatically be included there once they grow enough to be, to be a part of it. But you don't have to track the development of economy. This will happen automatically within passive investing. That is one very, very good advantage. But one of the last ideas is that I mentioned a lot investing in the US stock market, the S&P 500 index and so on. This is not the best strategy. In order to ensure that you really benefit in different time periods, you should invest in the entire world. Why? Because different periods are dominated by different regions. So it's not just that different sectors dominate different regions. You could see that 1980s dominated by oil and telecoms, whereas 2020s dominated by tech companies. But it also is applicable to regions, right? So let me tell you another story. Right now, there is sort of a craze around US stocks. Many people will be telling you that you should just invest in the US stock market. They find some rational arguments for it, but usually the reason why they are saying this is that they just dominated the last couple of years. The last decade, US stocks have far outperformed other regions, right? They have been the hottest, the sexiest, right? The ones that generate the most return. So that is why people will tell you that it's enough to hold them, just them. This was a different story back when my boss here, our chief investment officer, was starting to work in financial markets. That was in 2006, so before the great financial crisis. So what happened there is that in that period, roughly around 2010, US stocks had so-called lost decade. lost decade meant that US stocks.
We can't hear you.
Right.
We still can't hear you.
Can you hear me if I speak like this?
Yeah.
I switched to my computer's microphone, so the audio's quality might be a bit worse. During the break, which will happen in a couple of minutes, I will change the device that connects microphone to my computer. It seems that the cable is somehow loose. I'm sorry for that. Okay, thank you very much for letting me know. However, so I was talking about the lost decade in US stocks. So in that decade, they earned nothing. Whereas if you can see the large green spike, emerging markets rose by several hundreds of percent over that decade. So they were the story that dominated the previous decade, right? Emerging markets, they were represented mostly by this group of countries called the BRICS. So that was Brazil, Russia, India, and China. These four countries accounted for most of growth in that decade, right? And that is why everyone was only talking about them. My boss told me how, mutual funds centered around BRICS had the most sales. Everyone was saying that BRICS are the future and that the developed market is, aging, and that India now is growing and China is growing, and they have many people who they can still educate and pull into middle class. And once those people get richer, they will have a lot of spending, and the companies from China and India will be growing. And we can't really have that in the developed market because we are old and we are developed, and we, don't have much room to grow compared to those poorer countries. A story which makes sense, right? You know what happened in the next decade? Emerging markets earned not zero, but pretty abysmal returns compared to the rest of the world. They were the weakest region in the next decade. Whereas US stocks, which everyone was writing off after the last decade, there was the financial crisis and the developed world is aging and everything like that. The US markets grew the most because the tech giants who are accounting for most of technological progress right now emerged in that country and became giants and earned huge profits. So the expectations were completely reversed. The high expectations on emerging markets were undershot, whereas the low expectations for US markets were easy to exceed, right? So it sort of makes sense. So many times growth occurs in different regions in different periods. And if you want to be investing for generations, so for a lifetime, it's good to hold all the regions, because regardless of what happens, you are sure to hold the winning region in your portfolio rather than experiencing, just having a region that won't grow for a very long period of time. So that is why this is also reasonable. As I said, we think that the best way to buy the market, because I was talking a lot about buying the entire market, are ETFs, right? So ETFs are mutual funds, but traded on an exchange, which usually replicate the returns of stock indices. This means that they usually have higher returns, and that is due to two reasons. First of all, because they invest passively. As I said, even professionals face struggles when they try to beat the market because they make emotional mistakes and because they can't predict the future accurately. But also, where are low fees in this? Okay. I thought it was the second reason. Let's say reason 4 now. Since they don't have their sophisticated portfolio managers, right? You don't have a team of analysts that analyzes what the textile sector in Bangladesh is doing. And these people usually are super high skilled and they need to earn high wages, right? It's just expensive labor. So if you don't need these teams of analysts and portfolio managers to tell you which stocks to buy and which to sell, you usually can charge lower fees because maintaining that ETF is not as expensive as it is for other forms of investments. So ETFs not only usually have a better investment style, they are also super cheap compared to alternatives such as mutual funds.
They are also liquid. So, you know, compared to, for example, real estate, you can buy and sell them super quickly in milliseconds if there are trading hours in that exchange where you are trading. So it's relatively easy to get to your money. They have very widely diversified risk. As I said, if you hold thousands or hundreds of companies, if something such as an accident, I don't know, a factory burns down in one company, or it just isn't successful with its innovation, you will usually not even feel it on the value of your portfolio. Both fees I already covered. And one super, super important advantage in the Central and Eastern Europe, in some countries, you have zero taxes on profit. So usually you have this so-called capital gains tax. That is a tax on the profit you earn by investing. And it can be pretty high, often around 20%. So a fifth of what you earn by investing is often taken by the states. Now, since states recognize that ETFs are a good and reasonable investment tool, oftentimes they were advised to introduce tax incentives on investing in them, especially for longer periods of time. So in countries like Slovakia, Czechia, or Croatia, if you hold ETFs for a specified time period or longer, you will get a 0% tax on profits. They will essentially waive it. In Slovakia, it's after 1 year of holding. In Czechia, it's after 3 years of holding. In Croatia, after 2 years of holding. So oftentimes, you can also limit your tax burden by investing in them. Let me come back to this table. This is, oh, you see here I have the 30-year horizon. We discussed this table when we were talking about the first topic. So it compares the savings rate to earning more. Now let's combine the lesson from the first webinar to the lesson from this topic, right? We already said that it's ideal to save at least 10% of your income, and that initially boosting your savings rates is much more beneficial to your final wealth than trying to earn too much returns. However, as we saw in the long-term data, and it is a lesson that is oftentimes repeated even in financial press or something like that, right? You will oftentimes find people saying this number. So usually, over the long run, stock markets earn 8 to 10% per year on average, but you have to hold it for at least 10, ideally 15 to 20 or even longer years, right? Then this performance, 8 to 10% per year, has been relatively stable over history. You can expect probably something, it is rational to expect something close to that range. Now, combine a 10% savings rate, which is not catastrophic, right? I know that it requires some level of discomfort, some level of changing habits and everything. I'm aware of that. But you have to agree with me that 10% savings rate per month is not something that is by definition reserved only for billionaires or only for people who own companies and earn millions of euros per each year, right? Probably 10% of your income on a salary which is 15,000 euros per year here, which is, you know, also realistic for Slovak middle class, for example. So you could get to that 1,500 euros per year. This is like the yearly number, without having to establish a successful tech company. Now combine that 10% savings rate with 8 to 10% per year, right? So combine that with a return that is in the last row at the bottom or the row above the last row at the bottom. You can see that the wealth you would build there over a 30-year investing is in hundreds of thousands. It's 170,000 to roughly 250,000 euros, right? And the more you can save, the higher this gets, right? So the lesson I'm trying to illustrate here, and now imagine that, like, it's often counterintuitive for people. Many people, when they see these numbers, they don't think that is something realistically achievable for normal people, you know, for middle-class people. If you manage to squeeze out 10% savings rate and invest in the stock market for 30 years, so earning the 8 to 10% due to the increase in profitability over a generation, it is realistic for normal people to get to 6-digit financial wealth over their lifetime. And just imagine how many of your problems would be easier to solve if you had this money, right? The problem this requires is a lot of patience, a lot of isolation towards emotions in the media and everything like that. And yeah, some sacrifices to get that savings rate, which are not easy, and I get that. But the reward, the realistic reward, is pretty high in this case. Okay, that would conclude the second webinar. We will have the third blog about pensions as well, but before that, let's have a short discussion and a break, right? So I received 3 questions via Slido. Let's look at them one by one. What is the difference between investing through a bank and investing through a brokerage like XTB? I have zero knowledge, so maybe it's a bad question. No, it's an amazing question. So through a bank, they usually sell you mutual funds, right? So mutual funds are essentially function like pools of a lot of stocks and bonds. So what a mutual fund does, it raises money from a lot of investors, and each investor owns a certain percentage of that fund. And then they assign an analyst and a portfolio manager to select which stocks and bonds to buy and sell and when into those mutual funds. And they charge a fee from it, right? So they take some percentage of the value of the fund from you every year. The problem is that usually, first of all, this is the active investing we were talking about. You know, when I was talking about the number that over 10 years period or longer, 95% roughly of actively managed funds, they were comparing mutual funds, right? Fail to beat simple ETF investments where you just buy and hold it, right? Because of all the reasons we talked, like inability to predict future emotional mistakes and similar, right? And also, they charge relatively high fees, right? So mutual funds are known for being kind of expensive, especially compared to ETF solutions or something like that. So that is the bank, but the advantage, especially when you contrast it to a brokerage like XTB, might be that you have a professional who might know much more than you what they are doing, right? So when you are investing through XTB or eToro, you can just buy anything there is to buy, right? You can buy stocks, you can buy bonds, you can buy cryptocurrencies, you can buy ETFs. You can sometimes, no, that's not true. You can't buy mutual funds usually. So you can buy anything you want and you can do whatever you want with it, right? You can buy, sell it, decide when, mix up the stocks and bonds in your portfolios. So usually for normal people, especially if they go to brokers, to speculate and to try to pick the winning stocks and try to time the markets and be smarter than the economy, they usually earn less than they would have earned by investing in a mutual fund, right? Because these are all the investors I talked about when when I say that when you try to open an account, these brokerages, you often see the small letters of more than 50% of their accounts of normal people being at a loss, actually. So that can be super risky if you don't know what you are doing, right? However, the costs will be much lower, right? If you do it yourself, because you don't have to pay the salary of the bank, which is the fee, right? So you can decrease your costs, but you increase the control you have over the investment, which might come to bite you, right? So oftentimes, why I think that robo-advisors like Finax or similar companies are the good golden middle way is that while they have some larger fees than buying directly on the brokerage, they still build it on ETF solutions. They don't have portfolio managers, so they charge lower fees usually than banks and mutual funds. But they also help guide you through the investment, right? So they help you select a good proportion of stocks and bonds. They help you select the specific ETFs that you should select, which is the other question that we have. And they help you, they help you, for example, keep the riskiness of the portfolio at the appropriate level by rebalancing it. You can find those things on our website, right? But these would be the differences, right? Brokerage, more control, which can be bad, lower costs, mutual funds, expensive, professional managers, so it can be safer. But sometimes, having a robo-advisor and ETFs, if you know what you are doing, is better than mutual funds because passive investing is better, and it's also usually cheaper. There are a lot of ETFs, a lot. Do you have any advice on how to choose some to invest? Either use a robo-advisor, where you will get the portfolio recommended, or you can sort of do it yourself. And there, first of all, cover all regions. As I said, I had this slide. So it's good to have US stocks, it's good to have European stocks, it's good to have some Asia Pacific, emerging markets, something like that, right? So seek to have most major regions in the world. And so that can be by, usually on some ETF screeners, you can just select the region in some tick marks and have all of them covered essentially. Secondly, if you have more ETFs within the same region or asset class, then it's good to look for things such as internal fees, so-called total expense ratio, right? So still ETFs are charging some small fees in order to cover their operating expenses, such as, expenses for trading or for the employees who are maintaining the existence of the fund and so on, right? So sometimes, and ensuring that it replicates the index properly, right? You still have to take care of that. So they have some small fees called total expense ratios. You can look for the one that has the lowest. You can look at how well it was able to replicate the index. This is so-called tracking difference and tracking error. It is the sort of percentage deviation from the index. There's a subtle difference between tracking difference and tracking error, but no need to explain that here, right? These two metrics, the closer they are to 0%, the better they replicate the index, right? You can also compare the graph of the index and the ETF, whether it managed to replicate it properly. You can look at how large the fund is, because that usually means that it will be easier to sell and buy at a fair price, and it will also probably, have lower costs, and so on. So maybe the cost, the ability to reflect the index. Oh, distribution policy, that is very important. Distribution policy refers to the difference of whether it pays out when it receives a dividend or a coupon payment, whether it pays it out to you or just keeps it within the fund and buys new shares or bonds for it, right, for that extra money, which will lead to an increase in the price of that ETF because it now contains more shares or bonds per same amount of people, or just certificates of that fund. The reason this is super important is that, for example, in Slovakia, if you get the dividends, you have to pay a tax on it. But if you hold ETFs for longer than 1 year, which you should always do when investing in stocks, much more, 10 at least, then you don't pay tax on price rises, right? You don't pay any tax on profit. So if you chose dividends, so distribution policy, which is distributing, it's so-called D classes, so they distribute payments, you would have to pay tax. Whereas if you choose ETFs that just reinvest the money, those are so-called accumulating ETFs. So C classes, they are marked by the number C, whereas the distributing are marked by the number D, letter D. You will pay a lower tax with the accumulating ones. But if you live in a country where dividend tax is lower than capital gains tax, and there is no way to get rid of capital gains tax, then it's wiser to choose distributing ones, right? Because you will be paying a lower tax. So those would be the things to consider. But if you're a beginner, then maybe starting with a robo-advisor is more advisable because all these decisions are just automated and you get a portfolio that accounted for all these choices already in the past, right? So you don't have to worry about it yourself. But of course, you can do it yourself and educate yourself about this. There's a lot of content even on our website for that. Daniel, I see the raised hand, but I would first maybe finish the questions that were posted through Slido just to keep some order, and then I will, let you ask the question, of course. But thank you for the activity. Okay, what does it mean to hold ETF for 1 year? Does it mean not investing and just waiting for a year and then I can withdraw the investment? No, not investing. You can buy new units of ETF, right? So each ETF has a piece, right? When you buy an ETF, you just buy some number of pieces of the ETF, right? And you just cannot sell the same piece that you bought a year ago, right? So you can buy new pieces, but you cannot sell the investment that you bought for a year, right? So for example, I buy 100 euros worth of ETFs now. I have to wait until 30th September 2025. And if I don't sell it before that day, then I can sell it without paying, a tax on the profits, because usually the profit tax, the capital gains tax, it is only paid after you sell some investment, right? So it's not paid unless you unless you get the money back from the investment, actually selling it and arriving into your bank account. So you just have to keep and not sell for a year. Most ETF products have 1 month frequency. Are there products with higher frequency? I'm not sure what exactly this means. You mean frequency with which they rebalance the investment so that it reflects the index or something like that? If you could specify a bit, that would be perfect by editing the question or something like that.
That was meant that you are buying the stocks in one particular day. Every month 15th, yeah, and then.
Yeah. I'm not sure, to be fair. I would have to Google this. I can imagine that there are. Maybe they are more expensive a bit if they do it with higher frequency, because trading costs and everything. So I can imagine that there are, maybe for a higher internal fee. But I'm not sure, to be fair. I would have to Google this.
Okay.
Never. So sorry, I can't answer very exactly, but I don't want to lie.
Thank you.
Very nice. Thank you for the question. Okay. Oh, I see the last question on the Slido. The last question on the Slido says that even in the bank, you can invest into something like a US stock fund, and whether it's a big difference to invest there or into a similar, let's say, US stock ETF on an XTB. Yes, there is, because as I said, mutual funds, they usually have a region of interest, right? They are focused on a specific region that is within the investment policy of the mutual fund. That doesn't mean that they are not trying to do active investing, right? Their investment strategy just limits them that they can only buy and sell stocks which are located in the US, but they are still allowed to select those that they think are, the most likely to rise in the future, and they are still allowed to sell those they don't like. And they are still allowed to, for example, shift the portion of funds into cash if they think that times are bad and stocks will decline, and then come back from the cash when they think stocks will rise. So they still do active investing, and they still charge a higher fee for it, right? Whereas you usually can't invest into active mutual funds, so ones that have a portfolio manager and anything like that, on XTB, right? These funds are sold directly by their depository institutions. They are sold directly by banks and asset management companies, usually not on a stock exchange. On a stock exchange, you usually have the ETFs. So those have lower fees, but are passively managed. So you don't have no one telling you, oh, these are the 10 or 15 or 55 US companies that are the most likely to rise, and these ones you should sell. You just hold all the hundreds that there are, right, in that ETF at a lower fee. And that usually, I think, is preferable. So if I was to decide, I would definitely rather automatically buy a US stock ETF on XTB than buy it in a mutual fund in a bank, because data show that the ETF is more likely to earn higher returns, and it is also very likely to be at a lower price. So but that doesn't mean that mutual funds are regionally centered. They usually have an investment strategy focused on a specific type or a type of assets or regions, so that you can select whatever region you want, right? So they aren't usually super global. Okay, Daniel had a question by raising his hand. Do you want to ask that question now?
Yeah. Actually, I had a question about the second question that was in Slido, and I think it was about choosing the right ETF. What to choose from. And you mentioned you should definitely cover all the regions because based on the slide you showed before.
Yeah.
And my question is, does it actually matter? Because the slide you showed, it said that there was a kind of dead period for the US market during 1 decade. Mm-hmm. But then the US market became even stronger than before. So if you invest from the long-term perspective, let's say 3 years, does it actually matter to cover all the world? Especially if you, let's say, don't believe in certain political establishments, speaking about China.
I mean China.
Yeah. So does it actually matter if you cover like all the regions or most of the regions, or maybe if you just focus on, let's say, the US and Europe, maybe one emerging market like India or something like that, and that's it?
I mean, you probably won't make a mistake by doing that, of course, especially if you, I don't know, some people even don't want to invest in China because they just don't like the regime and don't want to support it in any way, right?
Yeah.
The reason why usually we are global is that even in very bad political establishments, rapid growth can occur. You know, like China was the fastest growing stock market for most of the period since it entered the World Trade Organization, despite being still a relatively crazy dictatorship. So you never know about the future, right? That's what we are trying to illustrate. Also, you know, people sometimes a particular region can fare bad even on a longer period than just 1 year. So 1 year, 10 years, right? A decade. So for example, the Japanese stock market had a terrible, it fell around 2000, like in the late 90s, and it recovered only recently in 2024. Mm-hmm. So, you know, you can have in especially if it's just one country, then you can have even longer periods of abysmal performance. But the portfolio you mentioned, you know, maybe some emerging markets like India or something like that, you know, India, Europe, US, especially if you also diversify the size of companies. So not just the large companies, but maybe also US small caps, European small caps, some Indian small caps, and something like that. That still sounds pretty diversified to me. So while I hold China in my portfolio, you know, because I want to eliminate my judgments altogether, and, you know, growth can also occur in dictatorships, especially since, you know, the markets that have good political regimes usually have more expensive stocks, as you know, as compared to the profits that you can have there, right? China now has super cheap stocks because no one will use them anymore, right? So you can get the same profits at a lower cost there. It's usually already included in the price that the political regime is bad. But it didn't sound bad to me, to be fair. You know, the portfolio that you said, I don't think you would make a terrible mistake by it, especially as US companies often are present across the world, right? So you get a lot of international aspect there already. So it doesn't sound like a mistake to me, but I wouldn't worry about that, about China too much, even if I had it. I have it in the portfolio.
All right. But that's not just China. I have a few Chinese stocks, but I consider it more like a gamble than an investment. So that's how I see China, to be honest. But can I have one more question?
Yeah.
Can I have one more question?
Yeah, of course.
I know it's a difficult one. That's why I'm gonna ask it. When is the right time to sell a profitable stock and lock the profit? And I'm asking this because I did a lot of research about this when Nvidia went up, and I thought, okay, 150% plus, is it good enough? And you know, like when you do the research online, you have like a lot of content about when to buy something and what to buy. But speaking about when to sell it, it seems like there's literally no content about it, like when to sell the stocks.
I will probably disappoint you, but I am a passive investor, which means I never had to worry about this. You know, this is exactly about like locking in profits from stocks over usually shorter periods of time. And I have no, you know, right to like say my tips about it to anyone because I've never traded actively, right? I'm not a trained professional in this. This is more of the active investing thing. And oftentimes I usually when I you know think about this or talk about this decision to sell a particular stock, usually the problem is that we usually use it to illustrate why that passive approach, you know, like holding diversified ETFs over very long periods and just there you just sell it when your investment horizon is over, right? So when you want to retire or when you want to sell the investment and buy something expensive for it, then you just sell it without worrying how high the profits on the particular ETFs or not even stocks in that ETFs are, right? And so one disadvantage of this active investing is that exactly you have to always ask yourself, is it too high or can it grow even further? And the problem is that oftentimes most of the profits when you hold ETFs or stock markets over long periods come from a handful of companies that grow by tens of thousands of percent or several thousands of percent over the years that or over the generation that you hold them. That's essentially, it's true that most of stocks in the stock market go bankrupt, and still the investment is usually successful and the stock market in general grows because the profit is often concentrated in a couple of super long-term successful stories. But active investors often sell them too early, right? You never hold a stock until it grows up to 7,000% because you're just too afraid that it will fall again, and it will often happen, and many of the stocks will fall again. So you realize it when you're, 100% in plus. And think about Bitcoin. Most people wouldn't hold it until you're in 10,000% profit. They would hold it until maybe 250 or 500, and then would be like, okay, this can't continue. Like I'm out. And you miss out on the subsequent growth. So because nothing can tell you whether the company will keep on growing until thousands of percent or fall back, it's probably more likely that it will fall back than grow to thousands of percent. I don't think there's really a way to distinguish it, like which of the two instances it is. That is why I prefer personally the passive approach, where I just hold everything. And if a company grows by 7,000% over a generation, like 30 years, then I will be there and have a part of my funds in it, probably even a percentage or something like that if it grows super large and has a large weight in the index. But I don't have to worry which of the cases it is, right? I hold both cases, even those that fall back and even those that continue growing. So, I usually use it to promote passive approach. I can't help with this. So sorry, I'm not experienced
I don't
enough.
blame you for it. That's actually the thing I really don't like about like actually investing and selling stocks and buying new ones, because you still need to have this in your mind. Like, is it good enough? Or...
So in the passive approach, you don't have to deal with it, right? And don't risk mistakes. Okay. I really thank you for your questions. I suggest moving to another topic because we have the last 45 minutes, so to at least properly cover it. We can have a short break until 20, and then I'll cover the last topic within the last 40 minutes. So, okay, it's a really short break, so just for, a quick bathroom or getting coffee or something like that. I'm sorry for that. And in the meantime, I'll set up the new presentation and try to address the microphone issue. So see you in 3 minutes.
Okay, it's 2020. First of all, could someone please confirm whether you can hear this microphone now?
It's working.
Perfect,
Yes.
perfect. Thank you. I had to change the cable, but yeah, there was probably a loose port on the other one. Never mind. Perfect. Glad to hear that. Sorry for the relatively short-ish break. I have to time myself better. Too much content to present. But let's jump right to the last block of today. So we talked about investing in general. We talked about managing your personal finance on a more day-to-day basis. Now let's zoom in on one major expense that you will incur in your life, and that is retirement, especially with the current pension landscape. Before going to strategies you can do, let's just gain a little oversight over how our pension systems work in Europe. So a typical European pension system is composed of 3 pillars. The first pillar is usually called the state pensions or the mandatory pensions. They are mandatory because you have to participate in them if you work. You automatically participate whenever you work. These pension systems work the way I described at the beginning of the presentation, so like a pipeline, right? They just tax the currently working people and pay out pensions to people who are currently retired through some social security contributions, which are usually mandatory for both employee and employer. Then you have the second pillar. This is actually a pretty interesting one because it works slightly differently in more Western-ish European countries and in Eastern-ish European countries. So usually this pension pillar is called occupational, right? And that is especially apparent in the Western model because in Western Europe, it's more common that your employer just contributes into this, right? So employers select pension funds for their employees and they send mandatory contributions into those funds. The contribution is usually specified in the labor contract and so on. However, for example, in Slovakia or in countries in the CEE region more general, we have a slightly different second pillar. So our second pillar works by splitting the contributions that would have gone into the first pillar anyway into 2 parts. One of those parts goes to finance the first pillar, so still to the current retirees, but a portion of the money that you would have paid anyway is diverted to your personal investment account where it is invested in a fund of your choice, right? So this is how it functions more in Eastern Europe-ish states. So, in Western Europe, it's money paid by your employer. In our region, it's more about not wasting money so that it wouldn't get absorbed by the first pillar, but you get a portion of that for your own investment account. Then third pillar is usually called voluntary pensions. So it is something that you can participate in voluntarily, right? So it's on your demand. It's nothing mandatory. And usually you have to do it yourself, right? So in most countries, third pillar is financed by your own personal contributions, right? You have to do it from the salary that you receive into your account and send contributions from that salary, right? In exchange, you often get some tax incentives. You can lower your income tax base. Sometimes you usually get profits, exempt from the tax and something like that. In Slovakia specifically, it is also very common for employers to contribute in the third pillar, right? So to send money on behalf of their employees. Maybe in some other countries in our region, this is also more common in the third pillar. So what employers are usually doing into second pillar, here they are doing it into the third pillar, and they get some tax advantages as well for themselves for, saving up in these products. Let's look at these pillars slightly more in detail one by one. So one of the important functions of the first pillar is solidarity, right? That is, if you're a below average earner, you can expect a larger portion of your salary to be recovered in old age from your pension, from the state pension that you will receive, right? This is financed by giving lower pensions to above average earners, right? So wealthier people, they usually get a lower percentage recovered from their pension. So the replacement rate I spoke about, right? The percentage of your working age pension that you will get in your retirement. The more above average your wage is, the lower that replacement rate gets. This is to ensure solidarity with those who aren't as lucky to earn as much, right? You can split this replacement rate as gross or net. Gross is before taxes, net is after you account for all taxes. So net just compares your paycheck after all taxes that arrives into your account in your working age to the pension after taxes that you can spend in your old age. And you can see that, for example, if you earn the average, the columns there are multiples of the average wage, right? So if you're in the column numbered 1, then you are earning the average wage because you are earning 1 times the average income. If you are in the column titled 2, you are earning 2 times the average wage, so the 2 times multiple. You can see that for average to above average earners, this net replacement rate in the European Union or in the OECD region is currently somewhere between 55 to 67%, right? So around 2/3 of your net income, which is not that terrible. What is terrible are the future prospects. So I already said that our country, our region, Europe in general, is aging rapidly. This is in part because of declining fertility rates. People are just having fewer kids than in the past, which can be due to a variety of reasons. Part of it probably is because it's expensive to have, kids today, as we already discussed on Slido, right? So it's not only it's expensive to have kids, but also people are just preferring to have fewer kids. More women can now choose to have a career and not, raise kids, or more people in general. And many people, young people, prefer to have this freedom. So you have more childless households today than in the past, just because of the opportunities and options that you now have in your career compared to the past. And in our region, the CEE region, there is also very specific problem, and that is brain drain, right? So our young people from Slovakia, from Hungary, from Poland are often fleeing to study in Western Europe or in other countries, right? Because they can get higher quality education, often a feeling of higher personal freedoms than here, and they just settle there and never come back, right? And that is another thing that causes the aging of an average person living in this region, right? We can see that on a couple of metrics here, right? So for example, the number of working people per one pensioner has been steadily decreasing and is expected to decrease even more. The average median age, right, so the average age of a person living in the EU has increased. So we are rapidly aging. And these last two statistics preempt a question that some people might have. Why can't we just borrow for this? And we already are, by the way. But why can't we just borrow forever for this? Well, the reason is that it already costs us 10% of our GDP, which is essentially everything that we can produce, is the income of the overall economy. So 1/10 of what we earn and produce and sell as a region already goes to pensions. This is only expected to increase as the number of retired people gets higher and the number of working people who we can tax gets lower. But we also have a lot of debt already. The average debt to income of European countries is already pretty high. And you probably yourself remember examples of when that went bad, right? Greece has felt very tangibly what happens if you just borrow indefinitely, right? You can borrow a lot, but then you can near bankruptcy, and everything that happened in Greece, such as spike in rates of homelessness, such as insane unemployment rates, such as inability of people to withdraw cash from ATMs because there was none. And that's not funny, right? That is a catastrophe that happens if you borrow too much. So we as a Europe, scarred by the Greek fiscal crisis from 2012, we know that you cannot borrow forever, and you have to find solutions that somehow, stabilize the pension system, even, without that, right? That leads to the fact that replacement rates are expected to fall. As I said, you are expected to have much more people to take care of as the state and much fewer people to tax in the future, which means that there will be just less income and more expenses, and they will have to, do something about it. So unless they borrow, which they can't forever, they have to decrease the amount of income from pensions. It's not likely to be done very explicitly because it's unpopular, right? That it gets cut by 100 euros a month suddenly. It will probably be done more subtly. That is, pensions won't be increasing enough to match inflation, right? So their real value will be eroding over time, and you will just be able to buy much less for an average pension in 10 years or in 20 years than today. What can also happen is that they just won't increase them enough to match the increases in average salary. So while in working age you will get higher and higher salary, the pension income won't change much, and you won't get a high percentage of the salary you were used to in retirement. As I said, it's expected to be between 20 to 50% in most European countries. So that is, oh wait, sorry, I didn't want to click on that yet. We are then faced with an unpleasant question, right? Probably, as we already discussed, you don't need 100% of your previous salary when you are old, because especially if you have kids, then your expenses naturally decline after they move out, start a life of their own, right? So your expenses, and you also won't need such a large house after they move out or something like that. You can move into a smaller, more modest place that is cheaper to maintain, right? So your expenses naturally will decline, but cutting them down to 50 or 30% of the original value, that sounds rough to me. Like that sounds like a stretch. It's probably possible to cut them down to 70%, but cutting them down to 30, that sounds like a more impossible task. So in order not to be endangered by poverty, or to be able to actually live in retirement, like actually spend time with your grandkids, take them to trips, help them maybe with school financing and similar things, it's good to have some extra money cushion that you will be able to draw supportive income from. And that is why I will discuss two strategies in this last part. First of all will be self-preparation. So just purchasing ETFs on your own with the aim of securing yourself for retirement. And then I will talk about third pillar and compare it to the pan-European personal pension product towards the end. So let's start with the self-preparation, right? Here is just a print screen from Finax algorithm of the expected result if you invest in a 100% stock portfolio. So there is a portfolio composed of global ETFs replicating just all the regions as we talked about, and investing 150 euros each month into that. For many people, this will be somewhere within the range of maybe 10 to 20%. It can be slightly more, it can be slightly less, depending on your situation. But for many people, this will be somewhere in the vicinity of 10 to 20% of their monthly income, right? So if you invest 150 euros per month, and we expect the roughly 8% appreciation of the stock markets that we saw on the past data, that usually over long periods, stock market grows roughly 8 to 10% a year. So if we count with that, you can see that over the horizon that is there at the bottom, I have the slide sort of small, so I don't see the exact horizon. I think it's around 40 or 30 years. You can see that you will get to hundreds of thousands, right? Or you are expected to get somewhere to that amount, most of that being investment profit. Now, what you can do after that, and that is the question that we already discussed at previous topic, is, not withdraw the 300,000 euros, and which is, by the way, pretty much when you think about the fact that you just invested 150 euros per month, right? That is the miracles that actually investing in stocks and not just holding bank deposits over your life can do, and also consistency in actually making the investment each month, right? So once you have this money, we usually don't recommend people to just withdraw the 300,000 and stick it under a mattress somewhere and then just like draw cash from that. As I said, once you reach 65, you are expected to live roughly 19 years in retirement on average, according to healthcare data. That is from Slovakia. I'm not sure how it's in the entire Europe, but it will be somewhere roughly similar, maybe even better if healthcare systems are better in the other countries, right? So you're expected to live roughly 2 decades. That is a very long period of time, which still fulfills, even the stock investments. So the trick is this. You can afford, let's say, a 15% decline, for example, something like that, because if you're 67, it won't hurt you much, right? It won't mean that you can't draw pension, because you will need the bottom 15% in 15 years, right, from your retirement. So you still have a very long time horizon until you reach that period. So while we wouldn't advise you to risk too much, and have everything in stocks, because there you risk major crises and you lose a lot of your retirement savings, which can be unpleasant. You need that money sometimes for major expenses, maybe, or something like that. So it's not good to risk too much, but you can still keep it in a portfolio mixed of stocks and bonds where you have some risk. Of course, like 15% declines can happen, as I said, but they won't probably hurt you very much. And what you will achieve is you will continue to benefit from the rising profitability of the global economy even over your retirement, which will allow you either to draw much higher pension or leave a significant inheritance for your kids rather than spending all the money. Here it shows that when you look to the bottom left, you see that I invested exactly 318,000 that I've saved in the previous step, right? So the result of saving 150 euros over my productive life, I invested it into this payout portfolio one-off at the beginning. And you can see that these are just the algorithmic projections from Finax website. So they show you how much you can withdraw, and it shows you how much you will have likely at the end of your life after you are done with the 20-year retirement. You can see that you can withdraw 1,200 euros and you will still have 6 digits to give your kids as an inheritance at the end of your life, right? That is expected. Of course, it can be lower, higher, depending on the exact state of the economy and what happens. You have the pessimistic, optimistic scenarios there, but you are very likely to have at least 6 digits, right? And give that as an inheritance to your kids. That to me sounds insane, right? 1,200 just from your savings. Combine that with what you will get from state, because you are still entitled to state pension if you have worked throughout your life. Combine that maybe with the second pillar. You are super rich. Like you don't have to worry about anything. You have such a high monthly income that, it would be more than most people earn currently. So that's more than enough to save up for a decent pension, and still give an insane inheritance to your kids that you can maybe use a portion of that money to finance their studies or to help them pay for wedding or to maybe help them purchase their first housing, because that is expensive nowadays and everything, right? You just, need to be super consistent over this. This covers like 50 to 60 years of your life, right? So that doesn't come in free. But this is usually how we recommend handling it. So 100% stocks over your life, 10 to 20%, and then flip it into a 60-40 portfolio, right? This is the sort of the 60-40 portfolio idea. So the payout portfolio idea comes from this study called the Trinity study. It was a study conducted by a bunch of professors at a university in Texas in the US. And they tested a lot of historical data, a lot of possible historical periods that happened. And they found that if you have enough money, so let's say you have a bunch of money, right? And you invested in a 60-40 portfolio, so 60% stocks, 40% bonds, at the time when you retire, and you withdraw 4% of the money in the first year, right? So that's the first year, right? You have to divide it by 12 furthermore. Then you have a very, very high probability that it will last for 30 years, which should cover retirement for most people, right? So that's really when people ask how much they need in order to draw a specific income in retirement. You usually have to take the annual amount you want to withdraw in the first year. So that's essentially the annual expenses you can imagine living on, or just the annual expenses that you want to cover from your own savings, right? Annual, so monthly times 12. And then you multiply it by 25. You will get the target amount that you need to save up until retirement in order to, have enough money to cover that over the 30-year period where you will be retired. The good thing about this is that this already assumes that you will be increasing the monthly payout by 2% each year to account for inflation, right? So you will increase your expenses so that you can, have the same income even if prices rise, right? And it gets harder. So this is just, a simple table that shows you how much you need to, it's called achieve FIRE. FIRE usually in finance means financial independence, retire early. So it's for people who literally don't want to rely on the state at all and want to retire even before the official state age, or just don't trust the state, so they want to handle it themselves, right? So this is, in the left, you have the annual costs that you need to survive, right? And you multiply that by 25 and you will get the amount needed to achieve financial independence. But, let's not get too scared or ambitious about this. I'm not saying that you should be living without the state or aiming so high. You can also use it if you want, you can also use this rule if you just want to know how much you need, if you want to draw some supportive income. So let's say you want to draw a supportive income of 250 euros from your savings in your retirement, then just multiply the 250 by 12 and then multiply it by 25, and it will give you an approximate idea of how much you need in order to be ready for retirement, right? And ready to draw that income over a 30-year period. Then in this table, people who have been involved in these calculations, these freaks who want to retire early, they also compute it by, if you play around with the formulas, you can roughly compute what percentage of income you need to save in order to reach full financial independence. That is, if you save the percentage of income in the left column, then you will be able to retire only on your savings within the years that are stated in the right? And the beautiful thing that I wanted to illustrate is that if you manage to save 20% of your income, you can get enough money, or you are expected to have enough money to retire fully on your savings. So just have the same income that you had in your working age. That is the assumption of this table, that you will retire once you have enough money to sort of replace your working age fully from your retirement savings, right? And you are expected to do it within roughly 37 years if you save 20% of your income. So if you manage to get to that savings rate, then you don't even have to rely on the state. So that's good news, because that illustrates that even for normal people, just saving 10, for example, getting to a 10% means that most of your income will be already covered by your own savings, and you will have a very decent pension. So that's good news, that even things such as retiring on your own savings is not something completely unrealistic for normal people, especially if you can also count on some money from the state budget, which will cover the basic needs, and you can get everything else by saving 10%, 15% of your income, right, over your productive age. Now, you don't have to do it entirely on your own. You can use tax-subsidized schemes such as the third pillar to help you with this. And that is when we get to the last block, which will compare the third pillar to the pan-European personal pension product, right? So here's a simple comparison table. I should have included one slide to also introduce the idea of PEP. So let me first spend a minute explaining what that is. You probably are all familiar with the third pension pillar, something that is, handled and created by your state within your country. Now, the European Union has recently created this European third pillar, right? It functions very similarly as third pillar schemes, but it is like the regulation and the legislation and the rules are mostly controlled by the European Union. The full name is Pan-European Personal Pension Product, abbreviated as PEP. You can see that in the right column. And it essentially functions as a third pillar that is freely transferable across European countries. So whenever you move from Slovakia to Germany, you can take your third pillar savings and transfer them free of any costs or free of any taxes into a provider that exists and offers that in Germany. So the idea was to sort of help facilitate these transfers for people who are more mobile across the European Union, which can be mainly true for people who are working for multinational corporations, or for younger people who often want to start their career in a different country but then maybe come back home. This can be made, this can make it easier for them. But I would say that this is not the main advantage. The main reason why the European Union pushed to create this scheme was that there is a huge problem with how third pillar schemes function across Europe. They are just super outdated, and there is very little competition to these companies. So they have been generating terrible results for decades, and no one minded because there was no competition, right? So the problem was that not only they don't have things like transferability, but they also have, first of all, very little transparency, right? So there are not very huge requirements of how the companies have to explain what the product is, what is included in it, what are the expected results. PEP has very strict requirements for documentation and education that you have to provide to the clients, but also legislative stability. And I would say this is the most major sort of advantage of having European Union back it. If you're from Central Europe, you probably know that second and third pillar are very easy targets of politicians who want more money, right? It's simple. Second and third pillar are something that will be effective for most people after a lifetime of saving, right? So they won't be in power anymore. Many of the politicians might not even live by the time you retire. So they don't really have much personal benefits from supporting second and third pillar, whereas paying out pensions now at the expense of savings that would be more long-term gives them popularity, because usually the current retirees are a very powerful voting bloc in most countries, right? So we often see that politicians alter the way second and third pillar functions in order to gain popularity today, right? So we have seen in Slovakia, for example, that the amount that you can contribute into second pillar has been consistently decreased over the years since it was launched. In Hungary, the prime minister essentially forced money out of the second pillar and forced savers to transfer them to the national pillar, where it could be paid out to the current retirees. It's very easy for politicians to meddle with second and third pillar. They can force them to buy state bonds, even if it means lower returns. They can limit the amount you can put there. They can force companies to change from stocks to bonds, which also happened in Slovakia, right? So it's easy to meddle with them. If you have European Union oversight, the EU is much more isolated from the pressures for popularity that politicians have, which can be a disadvantage in some contexts, but in this context is pretty good, right? Because they don't need to buy popularity of the elderly by limiting the second and third pillar. They don't usually, have to distribute money before elections or something like that, which means that in terms of the stability of interventions into the way this functions, it is expected to be much more stable than national second and third pillars. And then also, in terms of performance and fees, usually third pillar schemes are relatively expensive currently, and they have very little pressure on performance due to limited competition. When you think about it, there are just 4 companies in Slovakia offering the third pillar. That is not much competition, and they sort of were existing, having high fees and low returns for many, many years now, without much pressure to change, right? So the Pan-European personal pension product seeks to change this by having 2 rules. First of all, the European Union caps fees, so you can only have a management fee, no hidden fees, and the management fee cannot exceed 1%. And secondly, when you create a product, you have to create calculations in a very complicated way that is specified by the legislation, which has to show that you are likely to beat inflation and appreciate the wealth invested in your product in different historical periods and in different possible future scenarios, right? So when we were creating, and then once you fulfill this, you can get the stamp that this portfolio is called a PEP, right? That is when they officially certify you, right? So we had to undergo all these things when we were licensing our PEP. The specific European pension or third pillar solution designed by Finax is built on global ETFs. It has a fee of 0.72%. This will be important because we will contrast it to average of third pillar later on. So it has a fee of 0.72%, which is even below the cap by the European pension. And when we were modeling the likelihood of success, we had to cooperate with this external company called the Orange Envelope, or Oranžová obálka in Slovak, which provided us with their stochastic models to forecast the returns, and we had to show that in very different situations it would beat inflation, right? So to maximize the likelihood. Whereas with most third pillar products, if you check just the last decade, they wouldn't beat inflation even. So yeah, that's a set. And then what we did, this is a cool endeavor we had here. After we designed this product, we wanted to see whether it actually works. So we performed a major research of different third pillar schemes across the entire European Union. We studied almost all the relevant large countries, and we went after several important questions. The most important being, what have been the average returns and what have been the average fees in these schemes over the last decade, right? So we studied performance from the beginning of 2012 until the end of 2021. And since we have historical data for the prices of ETFs included in our pension solution, we can just use those historical prices, apply our fee to that, and we would learn, how much you would earn by holding those ETFs that we want to buy, right? Because there's no further sophistication in that. And we found that in most cases, not only are third pillar schemes more expensive, that's on the horizontal axis, right? The more you move to the left, the more expensive you are. The more you move to the right, the cheaper you are. Not only often those fees exceed the 0.72% we charge on this solution, but not in all instances. Some third pillars are pretty cheap, but a very minority. You can see just Belgium, Austria, Netherlands. But the biggest issue of the third pillar is that it just doesn't earn the returns of global stock markets because there is a huge bias towards investing in bonds, right? And also high fees, right? That is also what limits performance because you lose more of your money to the management company. So essentially none of the schemes that we studied, although, for example, Sweden or Ireland have beautiful and high-yielding pension products, so there's not really much issue in those countries, but most of them barely matched inflation. I have to say that these returns are already, average per year over that 10-year period, and they are also after subtracting inflation. So this is already adjusted for the increase of prices, what you would earn in real terms above inflation. So you can see that it's often like zero after subtracting inflation in most of these schemes. Here is a bit more research. This is borrowed from a research company called Better Finance. They have been performing very similar research to ours, but for many, many years. So they track how the median value of average fees in third pillars has developed since essentially 2000, as you can see there. And you can see that while the second pillar tends to be cheap, third pillar tends to be super expensive. You can see that right now the median is around 1.3, 1.4%. Median means that half of third pillar schemes they researched had a higher fee than that. Compare that to the 0.72 that I mentioned. That is, more than twice the cost for a half of third pillar schemes that is available across Europe. So tends to be expensive. But the biggest issue is unnecessarily cautious allocation, like unnecessarily much money in bonds or in cash and similar deposits, or maybe some other mutual funds, perhaps of their bank, right? But you can see that in many of the countries that are shown here, around like 30 to 50% of money is in bonds, which just doesn't make any sense if you invest for decades, right? There you can allow yourself to bear the stock market risk of going to a decline, be it for 8 years, right? But if you invest for 30 years, who cares for what happens in the first 8, right? If you manage to achieve the 8 to 10% average appreciation, that usually happens over a generation, right? When you invest for 20 or 30 years. So this is usually what causes the returns to lag. And it's a pity that there isn't more push to just invest more dynamically in these schemes, right? And that is why even if they are very skillful and cheap, which they are not cheap, they would be unlikely to beat inflation by a substantial margin by not having a dynamic enough allocation, right? Luckily enough, PEP is here to compete, so we will see whether it pushes maybe even providers of the third pillar to rethink the way they are doing pensions. But even this, research group, this Better Finance, they also recommended, having more stock investments in third pillars as a reform, right? After doing this research, they have been recommended it for a long time. So it's like a group of academics from different countries. Luckily enough, PEP is here. And in some countries, it is even transferable to, you can even transfer your third pillar savings to PEP. Sadly, not in Slovakia. Our government wasn't that generous. But for example, in Poland, France, Netherlands, or Finland, you can take your third pillar savings and without any cost transfer them to pan-European personal pensions. But apart from that, in other countries, it's possible for your employer to contribute to European pensions. It's possible to open that product yourself if you want to have some tax advantages, It often comes with advantages on your own contributions. For example, in Slovakia, you can deduct up to 180 euros per year from your income tax base. So you can save some money on income taxes from your own contributions. And I believe employers also have the possibility to get some advantage under a specific setup from pan-European, from contributing to PEPs. Although it is true that, for example, in Slovakia, sadly, the conditions aren't equalized yet between third pillar and between PEP. But in many other countries they are, which is great. Even employers got the same tax incentives they have on local third pillar schemes. So this is sort of as a fresh wind, and we're excited to see whether it will happen to move the market. Just to conclude, how to secure a decent retirement, you should aim for a relatively high replacement rate. I think 50 to 70% of the current net income is ideal after you repay your mortgage and don't have to pay for housing, and after the kids move out. You don't need to aim necessarily for 100, but this should be the expected result, right? You should aim to replace like 50, 60, 70% of your current income. I think that should suffice for a pretty decent life that will not be stressful, that will allow you to do what makes you happy, and all the things that you imagine as ideal retirement. The best way to achieve that is via long-term investing. So utilize tax-advantaged pillars, definitely, or the European pension, right? If you can select the strategy there, select index funds, right? Don't go into bond funds because those are for short-term purposes. If you are investing for lifetime, it makes no sense to invest in bonds which just don't earn enough to fully maximize the potential of the stock markets and of the profitability. You want the cut of the profitability, right? In the long run, you want a cut of the profits that owners of companies get, and that is why they are rich. So if you can select the strategy, select index funds. They usually earn the most. You also can get tax advantages on it. And on top of that, it's good to have some extra savings diverted into ETF investing. The main advantage is that if you invest extra into ETFs, you can use a part of that for retirement, but you're also flexible, right? If you need that money sooner because some emergency happens, or you need to do a more major purchase, then nothing is prohibiting you from withdrawing it earlier.